If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. What scary or creepy encounters and experiences have you had while hiking or camping in the deep backwoods or remote wilderness? I was out hiking around 1.5 miles in the woods behind my house when I genuinely thought my life was in danger. I had been walking for quite some time already, over logs, across creeks, etc., when I finally reached the ridge line that gave a view of the majority of the lower valley. The trail came out directly underneath the transmission tower, where there were obvious signs of recent activity, including beer cans, remnants of a small fire, and a few shotgun shells. There was nothing out of the ordinary to see at the site of a former bonfire. What really scared me was that as soon as I turned my back to head home, I heard what could only be described as footsteps coming from the opposite side of the tower clearing. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I began walking slowly, and the footsteps started again. At this point, I was freaking out, so I tried to do the reasonable thing and call out to the person who was obviously there on that ridge with me. The only thing I hear in response is the sound of rustling leaves and a shuffle of feet getting closer, a little faster than before. It's safe to say I just booked it down the trail. I ran as fast as I could, looking back several times but never seeing anything other than the obvious signs that I was hauling ass out of there. That's really all there was to it. Of course, it could have truly been a person, but it was at least several miles to the nearest holler other than our own. The usual hunters that roll in around deer season have already left. An animal could explain it, but to this day, I have never heard an animal sound that much like a human walking. Then again, I've always been the more paranoid and anxious sort of guy, but that's normally the root of most Appalachian tall tales and myths. I was camping at Heart Mountain Hot Springs. At 6:45 a.m., I was leaving my campsite by foot to use the nearest bathroom. The campsite sits above the field, overlooking the road that runs west to other campsites, a field, a creek, and the 3 hot spring pools. As I was walking out of my sight, I looked across the field and saw an animal. It was at least 200 feet away. I thought it was a wild horse, but there are no wild horses in the Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge. This animal's body was facing me, south, with its head turned slightly to its left. I thought it was a horse because it had a black mane of hair and its body was brown and shiny. It appeared to be about the size of a yearling at first. I say at first because later I saw a human man in the same location. There's a path there from the west campsites that travels to the parking lot by the east campsites, and I now believe the creature was 7 feet to 8 feet tall. It turned its head right directly toward me, then turned its body leftward, east, and walked across the parking lot toward the bridge across the creek, and I lost sight of it in the trees. It was bipedal. It did not move quickly, walking with its back slightly forward and its arms swinging at its sides. I later looked for footprints. The ground was too hardened to find any. I crossed the bridge and walked a little up the creek, north, looking for any evidence, like hair, but could not locate anything. What do you think? My only thoughts are either a person dressed in some kind of ceremonial gear or animal skins, although the height makes that unlikely, or an animal with chronic wasting disease, which also seems unlikely given that it was bipedal. Hello, to start this story, I want to say I have not seen anything like this in my life. At the time, I was 15 years old and petted a friend of mine's dog while they were out of town. Benson, Arizona, is where this took place. This property had a lot of acres, and it took about 15 minutes to get to their little house, right in the middle of probably about 75 acres. At the time, it was about 10 p.m., and my friend had 8 dogs, and they usually stayed outside for the most part because they were big watchdogs who seemed to have been able to defend themselves in the past. Before everything happened, I was inside their tiny home making food, and when I heard her biggest dog start squealing, kind of quietly, very scared and in pain but loud enough for me to hear, I knew the sounds were unusual this dog was making. I shot up and ran outside to see what was going on. I thought maybe the dog might have hurt himself or something similar, but this was not the case, and I ended up seeing a 5-6 foot tall pale, very skinny creature hunched over this dog sucking on his head. I was very stunned, almost too stunned to speak, but I managed to shake that feeling off. I start yelling at this thing because the dog started yelping loudly, and I'm telling the creature to get out of here and trying to scare it, and I run over to her dog as fast as I can because I've heard of these things before, perhaps a chupacabra? And I know they would likely eat the dog if I didn't do something, but I stopped about 10 feet in front of it to see this creature jump up and run as fast as it could away. I couldn't help but keep looking over my shoulder the rest of the time I was there. I also didn't let those dogs out at night, and I didn't care to go out there either. So when my friends came back, I told everyone what happened and what I saw. It felt like everyone was just as frightened as I was, which made me even more unsettled. I ended up leaving the dessert and not looking back. I still don't know what to make of it to this day, except that I know it was something demonic. This past spring, my husband and I went to Acadia National Park in Maine. There are tons of cabins to rent surrounding the historic town. Anyway, we rented a small cabin and had our dog with us. We had been there for 2 days with no issues. I had found a private side road a few hundred feet from the cabin that led to some newer, nicer houses. I even saw a woman putting her elementary-age children in her Subaru. I felt perfectly fine on that quarter-mile track. I also chose to walk my dog down that road because the cabin was along a highway and it backed up against thick woods. The first 2 days I walked my dog down that road, I didn't have any issues. The third day, however, I was walking in the morning and got a weird feeling. I felt like I needed to turn back, so I did. My dog, at that moment, started to whine in a way I had never heard her whine before or since. She looked into the woods while yipping, so I decided to book it back to the cabin. There were 2 dirt footpaths that led to this road. I only took the one near the cabin and not the other one near the barn on the property we were staying at. I get back to the cabin and let my husband know what happened. He had this look on his face. And then he told me. The night before, he had walked our dog towards the barn nearby and taken the other footpath. On the side by the trees, he saw what looked like animal skulls, 2 empty liquor bottles, candles, and other items arranged in a deliberate way on a table in the woods. He got a terrible feeling and retreated. Now my husband is in the military, has been to war, and has seen a lot of shit. He doesn't get scared easily. This really creeped him out. It further freaked us out because I realized we got the bad feeling near the barn. My dog was on edge after that, and so was I. I was very happy that we were on our way shortly thereafter. It also turned out that was the night of a full moon, so we believed it was possibly set up for a ritual or as an altar. So, I need some advice. I live in the backwoods of northeastern Pennsylvania, and yesterday, while hiking into state game lands, I heard my nephews screaming for help. Mind you, I am 3 miles from any roads, and they were miles away shopping. My dog was terrified. I was wary and ignored the yelling and just pretended it didn't happen. It went off and on for an hour or so, and then silence. I continued my way back home through the woods when I was done. Last night, after a bunch of storms rolled through, I heard my dog's collar tags tingling outside. He's running and walking with all sorts of tingles. He was next to me, his collar off for the night. He then proceeded to go hide upstairs next to my dad for the night. He's never done that before. Am I experiencing a skinwalker? I feel like I brought something home yesterday. So I dated someone who owned a cadaver dog. Basically, they can find dead bodies. It was a new term to me when I met them. Anyway, they explained that they worked with rescue teams. We live in wilderness country. The dog's job was to sniff out bodies for people who might have gotten lost and died, buried under avalanches, etc. After 5 months of dating, my, now, ex asked if I could house or dog sit. I was more than happy, too. Great dog. Would be dog sitting for 2 weeks while they visited family. I was warned it has happened on hikes before that the dog picks up the scent of a corpse and gave me the steps to follow if it happens. First couple of days. Pretty uneventful. Then one day the dog is dragging me down this trail, and I am panicking because I was like, oh shoot, am I going to see a dead body? But the dog stops at this very stern woman. I'm just sauntering along. He keeps looking back and forth between me and the woman. She gives me a quick "your dog isn't well trained" and keeps the dog. I had to drag him away. It happens with this same woman a few more times. So I call the owner to bring it up. I describe the woman, and my ex is so shocked and confused. Not familiar with the woman. Fast forward to my last night of dog sitting. I was going to bed and had this horrific nightmare of being held down in the bed by the woman. I hear a bark and wake up. The dog is standing next to me on the bed. In its alert position, staring at the bed. I didn't get any sleep. I never got an answer. The very first time I went to my boyfriend's family's house, we explored the very wooded areas around the house, 30 acres of land. Some hunters go in, but no hikers, only old logging trails that the original owner of the house probably created. A lot of the trails are poorly maintained, with brush and logs covering them. My boyfriend wanted to show me one area that was off trail. I hate walking off trail, I hate bushwhacking, and this was in the spring, so there were ticks. He brings me to a huge boulder he calls Dragon Mountain. Normal boulder, near a very small stream. He climbs up and then helps me up. It was much taller than me, but by no means gargantuan. We sit on the boulder, then lie down, looking up into the trees and talking. I am on the left, and my boyfriend is on the right. I don't remember if we heard the crunching of leaves first or saw them first, but to our east, 3 adult men, all wearing black or dark navy blue from head to toe, in sunglasses, are walking toward the boulder carrying a large, long black tube. All three of them are carrying it together, and none of them are talking. They are just walking, carrying this thing. My boyfriend and I are extremely still. We didn't feel the urge to greet them or say anything, unlike the normal people we encounter when hiking in the woods. They are walking toward us, but we don't think they can see us because we are lying in a sort of large divot at the top of the boulder. We can hear the men walk behind where we are on the boulder, and then when they are to our southwest, very near the boulder, they stop completely. They do not talk or make any noise. Naturally, my boyfriend and I stay silent and still. We are looking at each other, trying to take this in. It felt like a long time since there were no walking noises. The men then walked sort of around the left of us and the boulder, then walked off toward our northwest. They were still not talking at all, they were just walking through the woods, holding their black tube. We were very weirded out for a long time after this, and we got out of those woods pretty quickly in a direction away from them, opting to get to the road and follow that home instead of taking the quickest route toward the house, which was pretty much in their direction. We have both racked our brains for years about this, coming up with all kinds of explanations. My boyfriend later realized that the direction they came from was from a major highway, where there is a fence as well. We conjectured they may have been hunters, with the black tube being a device to carry a deer, but a lot of hunters live around there and tend to wear camouflage and orange, not all black, navy, or dark colors in general. I get that if they were hunting, they would likely be quiet, but they did make a fair amount of noise with their footsteps. Why did they stop? It just did not seem like three normal guys going through the woods. I forget about this encounter periodically, but when I suddenly remember it, I cannot explain why I felt the way I felt. We both had the instinct to hide and be silent. There is a strange old energy throughout the Georgia Piedmont and the foothills of the Appalachians. The geography of the area, that which has not yet been consumed by Atlanta's limitless growth, can be characterized by dense forests, rolling hills, and shallow red clay valleys, punctuated by small grassy meadows. Silty rivers and small streams crisscross the landscape, often filling up the valleys to form lakes and marshes. You are never alone in these forests, which are densely populated with wildlife of all strata. The region also hosts a large human presence, with booming Sunbelt suburbs sprawling endlessly into the ancient hills. As there are so many people in a relatively small region, it can feel difficult to escape the hustle and bustle of it all. Well-known trails close to population centers are often crowded, especially on fall weekends when the plentiful trees bloom with autumn color. I've been around long enough to know what hikes to avoid at certain times of the year, as solitude is one of the most enticing benefits of wilderness to me. Plenty of state and natural forests, as well as expansive county nature preserves, go relatively unnoticed if they're not among the top search results on all trails. My Labrador puppy loves to accompany me on any hike. After work one day, I loaded him into the cab of my tired old pickup and drove us out to a nearby nature preserve that we frequent. The small gravel parking lot was totally empty when we arrived. The trail that we took led straight from the parking lot and was one of the most popular. It was midsummer, and I knew that there would be at least 90 minutes before sunset, but under the tree cover, the landscape was already beginning to darken. As we got on our way, the roar of cicadas immediately drowned out the soft percussion of our footsteps. After crossing a whitewater creek and proceeding through a thicket of tall pines for not more than 2 miles, the view suddenly opens up to an expansive, untamed meadow. Markings on trees along the right-hand side clearly indicate where the trail resumes on the opposite corner, several hundred yards away. The majority of the meadow slopes down gradually to the left, dotted with occasional dogwoods, and is sliced off sharply by another wall of old-growth pines before the bottom of the hill. Although I was familiar with the trail, I suddenly found us cutting swiftly leftward through the tall grass and down the hill toward the grove at the bottom of the meadow. Both my pup and I were drawn with urgency to this off-trail area of the preserve, and soon enough we were at the trees and taking our first steps into the dim woods. Through the branches ahead, I could see a crumbling red brick chimney standing alone in the brush. It did not appear to be far away, but as we continued to advance toward it for several minutes, it seemed that we weren't getting any closer. Suddenly, a large black snake stopped us in our tracks, positioning itself as if to block us and staring with a raised head. This is highly unusual behavior for black snakes, which are normally furtive and keep away from people. This slight shock snapped me out of my almost trance-like state, and suddenly everything felt very wrong. I took it as a sign that we were not welcome in that part of the forest and no longer wanted to investigate the chimney. It took much longer than I expected to get back into the meadow. At this point, I was drenched in sweat and my pup was panting hard, whereas not long ago we were enjoying the relatively cool summer evening. The meadow, too, was now dark, and when I checked my watch, I saw that we had been off trail for nearly an hour. Everything was silent, no more cicada chirping. I've had similar encounters throughout the region, where the laws of space and time seem to be somehow suspended in certain areas of the backwoods. I've considered looking for the chimney again when I'm sure to have more daylight, but then I think about the snake's warning and the feeling of existential dread that I felt that evening. Perhaps some things are not meant to be investigated. When I was a teenager around 2004, we used to sneak down through a quiet area of scrub, over the dunes, and onto the beach to smoke weed. I lived in a very small, coastal town on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Typical wildlife included possums, wallabies, and maybe the occasional kangaroo. There are definitely no dingoes, crocs, or other apex predators around. One night, as we quietly made our way down the path, we noticed a shuffling, rustling sound in the undergrowth near the path. We stopped moving, and the sound seemed to stop as well. Except for some houses in the distance and the moon, there was absolutely zero light. After a brief pause, we decided to keep moving. We heard the rustling sound again, and this time we noticed some bushes moving. We stopped, and my friend whispered, "Holy SHT, did anyone else see the trees move?" I whispered back, "I only saw the bushes move." We stood there, frozen, for a few beats. In my head, I was weighing up the option to either continue on the path or leg it back home. We took a few more steps forward when we heard the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. At this point, I reached out and grabbed my friend's hand, thinking maybe we were being followed by someone. It was right then that I noticed I could smell something awful. "What the duck is that smell?" my mate whispered. His voice came out so small that it frightened me even more. We stood there for so long, but probably only a minute or two, until we heard a low groan or growl sound coming from a few meters away. Brushtail possums are quite common to the area and are known to make a kind of grunting or coughing sound heard here, but they are, from the ones I've ever heard, distinctly higher pitched and more chirpy sounding than what we heard. This was a low and more sonorous sound, kind of like ewer, with some strange catching tsch sounds at the end. Needless to say, we wordlessly booked it straight back up the path the way we came. It sounded to me like a huge commotion of leaves crunching and branches shaking and crashing behind us as we ran, but reflecting on it with my adult hindsight, it definitely could have been us making all that noise. We never went back to that spot again and would bring it up from time to time, trying to speculate what could have followed us that night. Our best theories were that it was just a bloody big possum or a person trying to scare us. The biggest issue we would argue over was why a possum would follow us. Let alone down on the ground, although my mate says he saw the tree branches move as well, and if it was a person, how did they make that sound? And what was the smell? And why didn't we hear any footfall? Maybe it was just a coincidence of events? A person following us, a nearby possum growling, and a nearby dead animal stink wafting over at just the right moment. It still makes me shiver to think about it now. So last year I went backpacking in the Central Sierras with a friend. We were about to set up camp in a spot just a few feet off the trail. I ventured further away from the trail in this rocky area to get a better view of the lake. If you looked close enough, there was a trail, not on any map, but a clear trail nonetheless that looked like it led to the base of a peak, which is known for climbing. I started following it, and I came across the most peculiar camp setup. It wasn't like any backpacking setup I'd ever seen. There were a couple of backpacking tents, but there were also those white foldable tables, a canopy tent, and a grill. A full-on cabinet-style backyard grill. Clearly, heavy equipment requires at least 2 people to carry each item. The nearest road was 6 miles away, and the only way up to that spot was by foot or horse. How the hell did they manage to haul all that stuff up there? I didn't see anyone. I saw all that stuff, turned around, and let my friend know. She went up to check it out, but she didn't see anything. Either she didn't walk down the trail far enough, or my mind completely made that up. Maybe the altitude and sun exposure got to me. LOL, either way, I didn't feel safe staying there, so we camped somewhere else. Anyone know how that stuff could have gotten up there? There is a certain spot in a forest near me that myself and my family have independently come to the same conclusion. The place is creepy as duck. We don't get the feelings anywhere else. This hasn't been previously discussed, where we might have subconsciously influenced each other to feel this way. It came up casually today when discussing where to walk on Christmas Day, and the feeling comes down to feeling as though something is following us in the woods in parallel to us. Now, I don't mean this in the sense that there is a mirror version of us moving in the exact same way. What I mean is that we feel as though there is an entity somewhere in the trees that is following us step for step. It's not behind nor in front of us, it is beside us. I'm wondering if we're all completely insane, or if anyone else has experienced this. To add to that, we do not feel this way anywhere else. It's just this one specific section of track through the forest, which shares the same features as all the other forests we regularly walk through. So last week, me and my friend went camping together for the first time, and something happened. When we got to the site, there was one other person there, a young, like early 20s, woman named Joey. She introduced herself, said she knew the woods like the back of her hand, and offered to show us around. We agreed, and off we went. She showed us the trails and the best views, and she was very sweet. She even joined us at our fire at night and talked about how she grew up camping with her dad. Around 12, she left, and we went to bed. When I woke up, I mentioned how nice Joey had been to my friend, but she had no idea who I was talking about. According to her, we were the only ones there, and we had found all the spots ourselves. And we had gone to bed much earlier. Over the next few days, I would keep mentioning it to her, but she was adamant that there was no Joey. Ever. We left after 4 days and have talked about it since, but she still doesn't remember, despite my having very clear memories of that whole day with Joey. I even checked the pictures I took. No Joey. Not even someone who looks like her. What the hell happened? When I was working as a backpacking guide in Western NC, my schedule dictated a full 8-day shift with 6 days off. During those 6 days, myself and other coworkers would play in the woods. In the summer, you can't beat a mountain swimming hole. One of our favorites was called Paradise Falls, alternately called Wolf Creek Falls. This is a cliff jumping spot with a huge swimming area, a tiny slot canyon, and an inner pool. Most will venture to do the small jump into the inner pool. Even though it's the smallest jump, it's arguably the least accessible. Even though the jump is 9 feet at most, you must work through a 10-minute rock scramble to get to the top of it. We were all venturing in, and from inside the tiny canyon, you can't see the main pool. Well, we got to the jump and coaxed the first person off. A fellow guide who had never been to the spot before. She jumped successfully and swam out into the main pool and beach area, then she screamed. Because she was now out of sight, myself and another guy jumped in together and swam the short distance to her, with the others in tow. Of course, we figured she was injured somehow. She was treading water and just staring wide-eyed at the riverbank. When I looked to the shore, there stood a man. He was massively large. Easily 6 feet 6 inches and a little change. He wore beat-up overalls and no shirt. There didn't appear to be a hair on him. Perhaps the most disturbing was that he had folds of skin all over his body. Imagine the Michelin Man, but made of flesh. His face, his arms, his chest, everything had a uniform layer of shingled fat rolls. And he was brandishing a shotgun. The area around Wolf Creek is just holler after holler, but there are a few residences. And those few have been there for generations, propagated by the same families. These people don't like outsiders, so they keep relations within the family. I could only surmise that this individual was the product of inbreeding over decades. He just stood there and watched as we scrambled to grab anything important and stuff it in a bag. He just stood and watched as we hightailed it out of that basin and back toward the parking area. He never said a word. I grew up in a small township in Minnesota, just north of the metro, in between the Twin Cities and what we call up north. The first thing I want to share with you is a story a friend recently told me about one of my other friends, who lived in the trailer park about 2 miles from me. We were fishing at our honey hole, located down a dirt road near a camp known as a Jawa. Although I initially intended to share my friend's story, a coworker's experience sparked the conversation. I was going up camping on the north shore of Lake Superior with a coworker, and he shared this with me. My coworker was a Boy Scout pretty much his entire childhood, and he had been to Camp Ajawa, which was situated right on Linwood Lake. He said he was around 8 or 9 years old with a group of around a dozen other scouts when this happened. Now I don't remember everything he told me, but I do remember him saying that they were all in the cabin during the day, no counselor. He said they all saw a black figure outside the cabin, but the one thing that he noticed was that it was staring directly at him. Things in the cabin started shaking, and they all ran outside, freaking out, looking for the counselors. Okay, so now after I had told my good friend about this, he had remarked that Garrett, our friend in the trailer park, had an experience as well. Austin told me that when Garrett was younger, he was out playing in the woods when suddenly he saw a little Indian girl, and she told him, "Follow me." So Garrett followed her over to a Jawa and into the cabin, and once he got in there, he heard her in the closet say, "Come in here." Well, he went in, said the door closed, and the entire closet shook. He opened the door and ran home, absolutely terrified. I am creeped out just thinking about this, and after a little thought, I do remember an odd night back when I was 12 or 13. My friend Nathan and I were having a sleepover in the shack my dad had built in my backyard. It was pretty cozy, it had wood flooring, a big 55 inches TV, and a few couches with a pull-up bar, but this was not enough to keep us entertained, so around my parents' bedtime, we slipped out the door and decided to head to a beach a mile down the road, which was near a Jawa. It was about midnight when we began our journey. Being young, there was a curfew, so as we headed down the highway, we would have to jump into the ditches whenever a car drove by and hide till they passed. We were halfway there, and we started seeing headlights about a mile behind us coming around a corner, so we scrambled to a good ditch on the property of an old farmhouse. As we got into the ditch, the car came into full view, so we laid down, and as we were waiting for the car to pass, we heard a little girl who sounded no further than 10 feet away say, "Hi." I looked at my friend in disbelief. It was now almost 1 in the morning, and there was no way a little girl was outside. We got up after the car drove past and saw nothing. The farmhouse was 50 or so feet away, and everybody was watching TV, but that was just odd. We kept going, albeit creeped out at what had just happened, and made it to the dirt road leading down to the beach. We walked for 2 minutes or so, and as soon as we came into view of the beach, my friend froze. I looked at the beach, and we saw this thing with 6 legs standing in the water. It looked like the size of a moose, but we don't have moose this far down south. We stood there for about 30 seconds staring at it, and without saying a word to each other, we both walked backwards, keeping our eyes fixated on it. As soon as we lost sight, we sprinted all the way down to the highway and walked back to the shack in disbelief. I don't know what that thing was or why we heard that little girl, but Linwood is a creepy place. I can remember other times when we were out early in the morning hearing screams in the woods. Normally, it was just one loud, horrible scream, too far away to know where it was but close enough to make us feel uncomfortable. Twice I stumbled upon pentagrams, one at the beach and another at a connected park. The one at the beach was the whole area of the sand, and the one at the connected park, connected by a bog walk, was smaller but in the grass, with candle burn marks at every point in the upside-down star. All of this really unsettled me, and I always keep an eye out for strange happenings now. One day, maybe soon, I will get together with my old buddy and revisit this area at night, just to see if anything odd still happens out there. I was about 9 or 10 when I first saw it. I lived in this really small town in Maine, the kind that had all kinds of back roads, and the houses were pretty far apart from each other. My best friend and I were playing flashlight tag in her front yard. I was the person with the flashlight, so no one else should have one. We only had one that was working anyway, so to say it another way, I was confused when I saw this strange yellow/orange glow coming from in the woods. At first, I thought maybe it was a fire, so of course I started walking over to it to make sure it wasn't. But as I got closer to it, the more I realized something didn't feel right, like everything was too quiet and still. I stopped at the tree line, where I was close enough to realize that it wasn't a fire but a lantern. It didn't look like anything was holding it up, but the more I looked at it, the more it looked like a black, cloaked figure was hunched over and was holding it on a pole. I didn't get to look at it for much longer before my friend's mom called us back inside. I wasn't going to say anything about it, but my friend spoke up and asked me why I was just standing at the edge of the woods. I explained to her what I saw, and her mom overheard us talking about it. She asked me to re-explain it to her, so I did. Now, she is a very spiritual woman, i.e., she has roots to Native Americans and still holds a lot of those practices herself, so when she told my friend and me that we are to never go out at night again, saying I was shaken was an understatement. After that night, for a month straight, I would see this strange lantern floating in the woods. Sometimes it was outside my window, just along the tree line, or in the field out back, but I only ever saw one at any given time. Now, as a 9 to 10-year-old, I never thought much about it. I just thought it was some cool new ghost friend that lived in the woods. The woods where I lived were part of the Appalachian Trail, so they were known for being haunted, but one thing I never thought to connect was the fact that about 1 month after I started seeing it, my dog got run over by a car. After that happened, I stopped seeing the lantern so often, just once a year, until now. I have noticed that over the past year, I have been seeing it more and more, but not every day like I did when I was a kid. The only thing that is worrying me about it is that my cat, who I have had my whole life, has been starting to seem a bit weaker and slower, and he has been hanging out by himself more often, which he never does because he has attachment issues. I guess I'm just wondering if anyone knows what this thing is or if there is anyone with a similar story to mine who can help me understand everything. So today I noticed something strange when I was in the woods. I like to go mountain biking alone and particularly enjoy the woods near my house. There is a pre-built track designed for bikes, and it can get pretty busy on the weekend, so I like to go out during the weekday when everyone is at work. Today, as I was cycling down the path, I stopped to catch my breath. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Even though I was in a forest, it wasn't far from the main roads. Normally I can hear the rolling tires, but today it seemed a lot more stifled. I was wearing cheap noise-canceling headphones. It was then that I noticed something strange. About 20 meters ahead of me, I saw a birch tree, and next to it was a sort of distortion. The best way to describe it would be like that wobbly effect heat gives off. However, there was no fire, smoke, or anything out of the ordinary other than the air, which seemed to be simmering. I stared at the distortion for a while, and it started to give me a slight headache. Intrigued, I cycled over to it. Upon arriving, the distortion vanished. I got off my bike and touched the side of the birch tree. Nothing strange happened, and it felt like a normal tree. There was nothing on the ground other than leaves and sticks. Confused, I continued my cycle, but now I felt more drained, and my headache remained. I have always felt a strangeness in nature. A power that I can't comprehend. I wonder if this has anything to do with it. I will go back out later in the week and see if I can't see another ripple. I'm hiking a lot alone, and the woods are usually the place where I feel the safest and most relaxed. This is why this particular hike was so unusual to me. I was already on my way back on a hike near the French border in Germany, and a sign announced a small spring 200 meters to the left that was used as a Christian pilgrimage spot, rebuilt after the grotto in Lourdes. I found a roebuck drinking from the water that ran naturally from a small grotto and sat down there for a minute. Since it was a very hot summer day, using the cold water to refresh my neck and cheeks, I didn't drink any. Once I got up to hike the last bit of the track back to my car, something shifted in the woods, and I can only describe it as the instinctive feeling of imminent danger. I heard a sound, like a deep, deep voice talking in a strange language that seemed to come right from the trees. I started to walk faster. Suddenly, there were the sounds of hasty footsteps all around me, behind me, and in the trees above me, like a dozen small creatures chasing me. I could see movement in between the trees, but never enough to tell what it was. At this point, I was running, almost stumbling over the old, gnarled roots. After 5 minutes or so, the small water grotto wasn't visible anymore, and I heard a deep, female voice saying something calmly from the left of the track, behind a rock. It sounded like an ancient language, just a few words. And suddenly, it stopped. The forest felt normal again, the birds started singing once more, and it was more peaceful. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened, only assumptions. Those Christian pilgrimage places were often built on top of old Celto-Germanic places. So maybe some old magic is trying to lure me away from the sacred place? Maybe just my imagination? A heat stroke? No idea. The hike was super beautiful, and I'd love to do it again, but only the thought of returning to this particular part of the forest gives me goosebumps. My boyfriend, Jason, a 27-year-old male, and I, a 23-year-old female, went on a month-long camping trip to multiple states. Everything had been going really well until October 9th, when we decided to ditch a campground reservation and randomly pitch our tent near Albion Basin within the Uinta Mountains, Alta, Utah, not far off the Kekrit Lake trailhead. We parked our car around 3 p.m. at the Albion Basin campground, closed for the season. Admittedly, it was a little tense because this was our first dispersed camping attempt, and we had no proper backpacking gear. Upon arrival, we realized the area where we wanted to pitch our tent was about 2 miles uphill. At this point, we started to express regret, as we had a planned campsite in Nephi, Utah, that we decided to skip on a whim. After grumping around a bit and having a large lunch to avoid packing food, we packed our backpacks with the best gear we had to get through the night as it was going to be 25°F. We set out up the trail, seeing the occasional family or couple heading down the mountain. As we trudged on, we both started to feel strange, as if we did not really even know why we were doing this, as if we should have just gotten a hotel instead of trying to play backpackers for the night, but we both felt like we had something to prove, so we continued. Fast forward, we made it up to Kekrit Lake, totally empty, so nothing like the pictures, disappointing and eerie. Whatever, we keep hiking up and up in an attempt for seclusion and flat land when we stumble across a decent space. I see a small cave in the distance and point it out to Jason to deliberate if it's a hell no kind of situation, but after he checked it out, he says it seems like a small animal crawl space, no biggie. We set up as nightfall was quickly approaching, played some cards, bundled up, and decided to go to bed early, around 8:30 p.m., as we planned to leave ASAP in the morning, maybe 5 a.m. We both dwindled slowly, and after what felt like 30 minutes, I woke up abruptly at 11:24 p.m. I woke up with a feeling I had never experienced before. I woke up wide awake, scared but unprovoked, and as if there was no way in hell I was going to fall back asleep, when I always sleep through the night. Jason was asleep, so I let him be and just lied there, alert, trying to listen to anything I could hear, which was nothing but very silent. Around 12 a.m., Jason woke up stirring, much to my delight, as I did not want to feel alone anymore. I told him I could not sleep, but he suggested I just rest my eyes as we were leaving early in the morning. I agreed, initially not wanting to be a baby, and I said I was very scared. This was very short-lived, as Jason could not fall back asleep himself, and we ended up laying there together trying to sleep when I ended up blurting out that I was scared. We agreed it was fine for us to just stick it through the night as it was now approaching 2:30 a.m. and we had a small axe and a pellet gun for protection, so I did not need to be frightened. Not even 5 minutes later, we are still wide awake, and Jason's head perks up so fast that my heart jumps out of my chest, and I whisper, "What is it?" He replied, "Listen, and ISHT you not." We distinctly heard the sound of gravel crunching under boots as if someone had walked up to our tent, stopped, and then walked to my side of the tent. I felt the blood drain out of my face in an instant. In real time, this all occurred in no more than 10 seconds, but my mind flashed a million thoughts, and for a millisecond, I was convinced it was a ranger coming to tell us we could not camp there, so I called out, "Hello?" My brain was entirely sure I heard human footsteps. Within 2 to 3 seconds of hearing the footsteps, Jason grabbed the gun and burst out of the tent for any chance to confront this person, as I knew he heard exactly what I had heard. Nothing. There was nothing there. As soon as Jason burst out and I followed him, there was nothing there. We heard something walk up so clearly, but nothing walked away. Hardly exchanging 2 words, we packed up our stuff, looking over our shoulders, terrified, feeling watched, and booked it down the mountain with only moonlight guiding our way, too scared to turn on our flashlights. This was the worst 20 to 30 minutes of my life, half expecting to look over my shoulder to find someone following us. When we made it to our car, we locked the doors and started the descent out of the mountains, almost speechless and scared out of our minds. At this point, we reached town at about 3:30 a.m. and slept in a well-lit parking lot of a grocery store. We have obviously since discussed what happened that night, and we are both haunted by the sound of those footsteps. To start this off, I need to give some context. I'm 23, and I currently live in NYC, but I have grandparents who live down in rural West Virginia. When I say rural, I mean the literal boonies. Their closest neighbors are over an hour away in a small town with a few houses and a Walmart. Last summer, my grandfather, whom I'll just call Robert for privacy reasons, had surgery done on his hip. The majority of my family lives on the West Coast, and my grandmother, whom I'll just refer to as Muriel, is very old and wouldn't have been able to take care of Robert. Because I was the closest family member, I was asked to come down there and help out my grandfather. Being the good grandson I am, I agreed to come down there for 2 weeks while he recovered from his surgery. Fast forward a week, and everything was going fine. All I really had to do was help my grandfather up and down the stairs and walk his dog, a blue heeler named Rocky. Normally, my grandfather would walk Rocky once in the morning and once at night through the woods behind their property, but because of his surgery, that responsibility fell onto me. This was the part that I hated about helping him because, ever since I was a kid, I never liked those woods behind the property. Whenever I'd go down there as a kid, me and my cousins would always get creeped out going into that forest. It always just felt off for some reason. Anyway, for the first week, walking Rocky in the forest at night was fine, even if a bit creepy. That is, until one night, a week into my stay, I was walking him through the forest. It was around 8:30, and the sun was setting over the Appalachian Mountains. Everything was going normal until I heard a strange whistle that sounded like it was only around 20 yards away. Both me and the dog stopped dead in our tracks and looked in the direction the whistling came from. I shined my flashlight in the direction, but I didn't see anything, so I just assumed it was a bird. Looking back, it definitely wasn't a bird. There are no nocturnal birds that chirp and whistle out there, and it sounded more musical than anything a bird could whistle. But the dog was spooked. He wouldn't stop growling and staring at whatever was back there, and he kept trying to back up until whatever or whoever this thing was whistled again, too, at which point the dog started barking and going crazy. At this point, I decided that I definitely didn't want to stay there, so I yanked on the dog's leash, and we both bolted out of the woods and straight back home. When we got back and I told my grandparents what happened, they both seemed spooked, and my grandmother immediately asked if I whistled back. I told her that I didn't, and she seemed relieved but told me that I didn't hear anything and to just ignore it. I asked why, and she wouldn't tell me and would instead just tell me I didn't hear anything. I decided not to press it any further, and I went to bed, terrified and wondering what she seemed so freaked out about. The next morning, she told me that instead of walking Rocky through the woods, I could just take him on laps around the house, so that's what I started doing. Every night, I would take Rocky for around 50 laps around the house before going back inside. On Friday, the third to last day I would be there, At night I was taking the dog for laps as usual until I heard that same creepy whistle behind the attached garage, which was only around 10 yards from the house. This time, I immediately took the dog back inside and locked the doors. The rest of the night, I put my earbuds in, and I ignored any more whistling, like my grandmother told me to. To this day, I still don't know what was whistling in those woods. Some of my friends said it was a snooker, but that's a Navajo thing, and there's almost no Navajo in West Virginia. My girlfriend, who stayed back in NYC, asked her Muslim parents, who are from Yemen, and they said whistling at night is a sign that a jinn is nearby. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was, my grandparents were legitimately scared. I've heard of weird shit happening in Appalachia, but this is the first time I've ever had a first-hand experience with it. Does anyone have any idea what this could have been? When I was a junior in college, I went camping with 4 friends in Bald Eagle State Park, Pennsylvania. We reserved a campsite deep in the park, on a mountain, far from other campsites. It was located at the end of a narrow dirt road, maybe about 75 feet long, which itself broke off from the main road, which I think was also dirt. There was nothing at the end of the little road but our campsite. We parked at the entrance to the park and spent the day hiking up to the site, setting up camp, and then hiking around. We made a fire, made dinner, and turned in. Not long afterwards, we discovered that one of the guys with us snored loudly. Like walls of the tent shaking snores. Truly deafening stuff. After probably half an hour or so, the rest of us gave up on trying to sleep and climbed out of our tents, leaving our loud friend snoring away in his. My friend at the time was a DJ for our school's radio station, and she had a late night show. I think she was on between midnight and 2 a.m. Since we couldn't sleep, we trekked up to the main road, where the reception was better and where we would actually be able to hear the radio over the snores. When we got to the road, we stood in a loose circle near the entrance to our site. As we stood there, a black pickup truck with its lights off appeared out of the woods and passed us very slowly. It was unmarked, not a Ranger. We listened to the radio for maybe half an hour or 45 minutes after that and even briefly called in to say hi. Finally, though, we decided to head back to bed. One of the girls went off into the woods to take care of some things while I climbed back into the tent I shared with her and got into my bag. After a couple of minutes, I heard her moving through the leaves towards the tent, coming from my right. At the same time, I also heard the unmistakable rumble of tires on the ground. I stood up and looked out of the little screen window on the tent. We hadn't bothered to put up the rain fly, as it was a perfectly clear night with a very bright moon, so I could see everything. I saw my friend sprint back to the tent and duck behind it just as the black truck pulled into our campsite, still with its headlights off. And then it shuts off its engine. And sits there. Our friend is still snoring. I have a little knife in my tent, and I know my other 2 friends have at least one in theirs, but we have no other weapons, no guns or bear spray. So we just watch. As I said, it's a clear night, and I can see the truck just fine. It's maybe 20 feet from my tent. But I can't see who's in the truck or how many people there are. Nothing seems to move inside the truck. I still remember the metallic clunk as the engine cools off. I honestly have no idea how long I just watched it. My friend had ducked down behind our tent, and I could hear from her breathing that she was terrified, but neither of us said a word. It feels like a really ducking long time went by. It had to be at least 10 minutes, but could have been half an hour or more. We just kept waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually the truck started up again and then backed up down the long, narrow dirt road. It never turned its headlights on. I heard it drive back in the direction it had originally come from, and that was it. My friend burst into the tent a second later. Now we're all talking. Did you see that? Holly SHT. Duck, but our friend is still asleep. Eventually, we just went to bed. We packed up and headed out in the morning as we planned. And yes, we checked with the park, and they do not own any black, unmarked SUVs, nor did any ranger come to check on our site in the night. This was one of the most creepy and traumatizing things that has ever happened to me. I was staying with my family, mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa, in an A-frame chalet-style cabin in northern Washington. Washington has a lot of forests and densely wooded areas. This cabin was also on a lake, and we brought our small lake boat with us. This trip was mostly so we could try out our new boat. Everything was going well, we were having fun on the lake, hanging out with family, and just generally having a good vacation. My family decided to go to a convenience store and leave me alone in the cabin. This happened a while ago, but I was old enough to stay home alone. The nearest convenience store was about 30 to 45 minutes down a dirt road. As you may have expected, this is where it started to go wrong. They leave, and I volunteered to stay home because I am relaxing and don't want to have to get in a car. About 15 minutes after they left, it started to get dark. I am walking around, listening to music, and enjoying the sunset perfectly framed over the lake. Chalets generally have pretty large windows, and this specific cabin did not have curtains. This made watching the sunset pretty enjoyable, but it did not help once the sun fully set. Washington is known for its forests and is also known for Bigfoot. This story is not related to Bigfoot as it is just a legend, I am just pointing that out for reference, so at this point, I am messing around and exploring the cabin more because the sun has now set and there isn't really much besides a dark, kind of creepy forest and the lake outside of the window. As I am messing around, something catches my eye. I swore I could have seen very slight movement down by the small boat dock, about 125 meters down a small windy path or hill. I didn't really think much of it as I was in the forest, and there are many animals that could have been moving around. Deer, moose, etc. At this point, I have forgotten about the movement I saw and head to the bathroom, which is down a hallway away from the window. While I was in the bathroom, I just got this terrible feeling, like something was wrong. I wanted to go check to see if there was anything inside the cabin or anything outside. I couldn't do this, however, because I was, well, using the bathroom. The longer I stayed in the bathroom, the worse the feeling got. Every drop of rain landing on the roof felt like the tick of a clock counting down to the end of the world. I quickly finished up in the restroom and practically sprinted down the hall. I looked out the large set of windows and saw nothing but the lifeless forest and the moonlight reflecting off of the lake. I then start to feel that stereotypical feeling of being watched. Generally, nothing even is watching you. Or so you think. This time, there was something watching me. I turned around and looked down the hall at the other clear glass door at the end of the hallway. Standing on the other side of that door is a freaking deer standing on two legs. My mind instantly screams skinwalker. I try not to acknowledge it. I close my eyes and sprint back to the bathroom, locking myself in the bathroom as it is the only room without windows. I sit there in silence, barely breathing, for what feels like 12 years. My family finally got back, and when I came out of the bathroom, nothing was there. After checking the next morning, there were no signs that anything had ever been there. You can choose whether to believe me or not, you can choose whether to believe that it was all in my head. But even if it was all in my head, it was still truly a scary experience. My life took a drastic turn when I was 16. I was unable to move for months after suffering a severe back injury that left me bedridden. The psychological toll of being confined to a hospital bed and forced to spend every day staring at the same four walls was as severe as the physical pain. But I was determined to heal and regain my life. As soon as the doctors gave me the all clear, I realized that in order for my body and mind to really heal, I needed to get outside. My mother concurred that perhaps what I needed was a camping vacation in the stunning Devon countryside. She packed me my tent, some supplies, and a portable charger so I could always have a fully charged phone when I got to a distant forested region. I had located what appeared to be the ideal, secluded area for camping. It appeared to be on private property, but as it was becoming late, I didn't want to take the chance of camping too close to a public place. I immediately put up the tent as night fell, opened a cider, and launched YouTube on my phone in order to unwind. At that point, things started to get gloomy. The battery on my phone was draining faster than usual, even when charging. I tried not to give it too much thought, but it was strange. At that point, I heard it, the distinct sound of heavy footfall fast approaching through the undergrowth. My heart was racing, I could hear at least 30 footsteps. Was the hiker hostile? Could it have been a landowner wielding a shotgun? I opened the tent in a panic and held up my hands, ready to confront whatever was outside. However, nothing was present. Only the spooky forest silence. The footsteps that had been almost upon me moments earlier immediately vanished into an unearthly void. I felt a wave of terrible dread come over me at that time. This place has an awful lot going on. My instinct told me I wasn't alone, so I carefully turned my head. That's when I finally spotted it, standing barely 20 feet away, motionless but definitely alive. A gigantic, skeleton creature that stood 5 feet tall and resembled an emaciated, hairless dog. With its lips drawn back to reveal rows of sharp teeth, its blank visage was fixed in an eternal bestial snarl. Never before have I experienced such raw, verbal dread. Not even a thought of fighting or flying crossed my mind as I automatically scrambled backwards into the tent, zipped it up, and curled into a tight ball on the ground. The sight of that thing had simply caused my mind to overload and shut off. In desperation, after God knows how long, I thought to check my phone. I quickly switched it out for the portable charger because it was completely empty. With only 3% of the battery left, it sat there for an excruciating 50 minutes before turning back on. I texted my mother in a panic, dropping my location pin and a pre-arranged code phrase for an emergency extraction, all while shaking hands. Before she could say anything further, the phone died again. I had no choice but to curl up in my sleeping bag and try not to think about the kind of unholy monstrosity that might be hiding just beyond those flimsy nylon walls. Like a waking nightmare, the following several hours flew by. I had terrifying pictures of the massive, bony thing approaching to make the kill whenever I heard even the slightest sound, like a rustling shrub or a snapping twig. At last, the pleasant sound of an engine in the distance reached my ears. I ventured outside, and when I saw my mother's car arrive, I almost passed out in relief. I hurried for her arms without even waiting for the code response. I just grabbed my stuff and ran, leaving the tent and everything else behind. I still cannot think of any logical reason for what I saw in those woods. Perhaps a vivid waking dream or delirious hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion was the cause. Perhaps it was just a mischievous trick of light and shadow, adding insult to injury to my already strained emotions. All I know is that this kind of pure, basic horror has never before since left me. My body had been stripped of all capacity for reason, thought, or behavior. The most primal instincts for survival were all that were left. In general, I don't think much of the paranormal. However, I will always remember that day in Devon as an omen, a sign from the cosmos that there are some places best left unaltered by human trespassing. I can't bear to consider what other hideous creatures may have emerged from the dark, ancient forest if I had persisted with my disastrous camping trip. This is the only platform where I can share my experiences, a place where people of sound mind will believe me. I've listened to so many stories about the things people have seen. I know they're true because they're in my line of work. I fight the things that hide in the dark, and I've been doing it for 30 years. I'm one of the best on the job. I've seen so many things that can kill a man in 5 seconds flat if they have their pants down. So what I'm saying is that I'm used to the monsters and to the things that break your notion of what could be possible. I haven't seen something that truly scared me for about 25 years while on the job. The weird part is that I wasn't technically on the job when it happened. It happened a few days ago. I was on the road back home from a job I had in a small town in Canada. Some strange monster I had to fight, pretty basic stuff. I was driving through Maine to get back to my home in Kansas. It was nighttime, and I still had 24 hours to drive to get home, so I thought I would drive through the night to get there sooner. So I have this idea to drive through a forest so I can get some fresh air. After all, I enjoy the woods. I think the aura they have is calming, and the job can be stressful, so any moment of relaxation I'll take. I was really enjoying everything about that moment, from the cold air of the wind going by to the smell of the trees and nature around me. But that's when I heard it. It was the sound of a person screaming in pain, but it sounded wrong. Wispy and ethereal. I knew exactly what it was, a shifter. I don't have time to really explain them, but they aren't that important to what happened. I slowed the motorcycle to a stop and got off. I grabbed my knife off my boot and walked into the woods, turning on the flashlight on my collar. After a few minutes of walking, I saw the shifter. One of the strongest ones I've seen from its appearance. I turned off my flashlight and attempted to walk back to it so I could get away from it. I did not have the equipment for this beast. I thought it would be a pretty average one, not an alpha. I've seen strong ones tear buses apart with their claws. I'm certain that the one I saw could have taken down a tank if it was forced to. But that's when I heard it. A broken voice was crying out in what sounded like pain. Help me, please. God help me. Someone, anyone. I could see from the appearance of the shifter that the voice wasn't one of its prior hunts. It was someone new. The shifter didn't even bother to change form. It knew the person wouldn't be able to get away from how distressed and in pain they sounded. Something about the voice didn't sound right. It sounded wispy and ethereal with a bit of distortion and crackling. Something was copying the shifter. The look on the shifter's face changed and told me enough. It was scared. Something came out of the woods in front of the shifter. A shadow walked in front of it and stared at it. Shadow is the best word for what it looked like. It actively sucked up light. It was darker than a shadow. The shadow stared at the shifter and grinned. I could see bright white, sharp teeth form into a smile. The shifter started backing up in fear. Before I could process what was happening, the shadow willed itself towards the shifter and started tearing the thing to pieces. In a few moments, the shifter was torn to ribbons. I've seen my coworkers slaughtered by shifters. Even average ones pose a massive threat if not handled wrong, and this thing scared and killed an alpha with ease. As the shadow stood over the corpse of the shifter, I tried to back up, and the noise alerted the shadow. A feeling lodged itself in my head, that it knew I was there. I kept watching, my legs frozen still. I see the shadow turn its head up at the sky, like it was looking at something, and nod. Suddenly, it snapped its head toward me faster than I could blink. It stared into my very soul, its gaze filled with bloodlust and hatred. The lock on my legs was broken, and I stood up and started running back to my bike. As I ran, I swear, I could see the thing standing on my peripherals, glaring with rage in its eyes. Even weirder is that I swore it was right behind me, getting ever closer. Eventually, I saw the light of the motorcycle peek through the trees. A little closer, I kept thinking over and over. Finally, I hop on the bike and start speeding off, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I gathered my strength, looked behind me, and saw it standing there, watching me. That's not the worst part. Above the tree line, high in the air, I saw a beast, human-shaped. It was 300 feet tall. Featureless, just like the thing that chased me. Just standing there, watching me drive away. Gently swaying from the wind, it slowly moved its head to watch me leave. I don't know what to do. I've fought big things, but nothing that big. I've been sitting at home, drinking, and watching television to distract myself from what I saw. But even in my dreams, I see it. I told the people I work for what I saw, and they still haven't gotten back to me. I think they don't believe me. I've told my coworkers, and they think I'm joking. I know what I saw, things out there, and they're dangerous. The location is a campground that may or may not be currently accessible. I know it was closed, gated off from the road, for quite a while, a good few years ago. Factory Shoals Campground is a good 20 minutes outside of Covington, Georgia. Yes, that's where they filmed The Vampire Diaries. Anyway, Factory Shoals Recreation Area. The campground. I'll say that I've never seen many other people out at this huge park, even on the nicest days, but a friend lives in a subdivision down the road. The area is sporadically rural, if that makes sense. You'll come across a school, a gas station, and a pretty big neighborhood, but nothing else for another 6 or 7 minutes down the road. The campground is next to the Alcovy River. In order to reach it, you have to drive through Newton Factory Cemetery, an old cemetery with mostly older graves sitting on the side of the road, slightly hidden by trees, smack in the middle of nowhere. I've often wondered about this. Graves date back to the 1800s, maybe illegible ones are even older, and at some point somebody says, hey, let's put a road through the cemetery and create a campground. So you go down this janky road through the cemetery for about a quarter mile, and here you are, a barely managed campground. There are maybe 7 sites, mostly next to the river. I'm with a friend. It's a nice evening, the light bustling of the river is calming. There's only one other site occupied a bit down, there are no street lamps, and the only light you have is the fire and your flashlight. As we prepare for bed, we extinguish the fire, leaving the area in complete darkness. You can see the stars, there must not have been a moon that night. I'm laying down and closing my eyes, and I realize it's too damn quiet. Deafening silence. I jump back up and go to my friend's tent and tell her I'm suddenly feeling creeped out. We both realize the bugs and even the river have gone silent. To be fair, the river is only about 8 feet across and about 2 feet deep here. We had commented on the peaceful lull of the river all through the evening. With curiosity stronger than fear, we walk over toward the water and observe a mist or fog lifting from the water. We are a little anxious and don't want to get right up on the bank to see if we can see the water moving, so my friend remembers a light-up fishing lure type thing she has in her bag, fetches it, tosses it in, and it just sits there, it doesn't flow down. So it's like the river came to a complete stop in its movement, is releasing a thick mist, and is completely dark and silent, except for that lure and its faint red glow barely visible through the thick mist. We both kind of start muttering that we should maybe pack up quick and leave before I see the spark and hear a gun firing not 15 feet away from us, shine a light for a split second before we're both in the car, it's cranked, and we're tearing out of there. I didn't see anyone either from shining my light or from the headlights, and I about had a panic attack coming through the cemetery after that with the elongated shadows from headstones and monuments. I didn't sleep that night, even after crashing on my friend's couch. Logic tells me the quiet could have come from a prowling human with a gun, but the mist and a river current stopping? And what if? Who or whatever followed us? I didn't even gather my tent and sleeping bag before going home the next day. I luckily had placed my bag in my car for some reason instead of taking it inside, so my only loss was the small old tent, the sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, and a camp chair. So it's maybe a year later, and I'm in the area with my husband, and he doesn't believe me about a campground on the other side of a cemetery. It's midday, and I decide to show him, pull up, and see that the road is now blocked off beyond the graves with a sign that states the campground is currently closed. We get out a minute later to walk around the cemetery. It's a dirt road, and there's a lot of kicked up dust settling. So much so that my husband asks if there's water in my trunk, he's coughing. I go to get it, cursing under my breath at the thick layer of settled dust already on my precious sports car, and notice a very clean and distinct, fresh tiny handprint on my trunk. It had to be fresh because I stood there and watched the still settling dirt start to stick and fill it in. We'd never made it more than a few feet from the car, there's no one else out there. Again, we booked it out of there. I know there's a legend about parking cars on hills in certain areas at night, and you'll find little hand prints on the back and your car will have moved. My car didn't move, but those were legit, fresh little hand prints. I'm not sure if the cemetery brings playful souls, the entire area holds onto some type of energy, or there's just some incredibly sneaky people that hang out in minimally trafficked woods and backroads. I'll reiterate that this is part of a park, a recreational area that has grills and picnic tables about 3 minutes down the road, and I never saw anyone there the few times I visited aside from my friend, husband, or the other 10 I saw further down the river when we tried to camp. I've never gone back. I've been to other places in Newton Company that give off similar vibes, though. The Alcovy Trestle. Gaither Plantation. A random church smack dab in the middle of the woods. That creepy old gas station. That's the story. This isn't a fictional story. I just want to see what people have to say who are into this. Maybe this community will help. My wife and I have been having a lot of paranormal activity. After moving into a wooded area just outside of Pittsburgh, our house is isolated from the neighborhood. That only makes the fear of something terrible happening even worse. I would like to point out that I and my wife are logical and rational thinkers who are educated to some degree. I am not able to explain the events because of my fear of ruining people's perceptions of our family. We've turned to you guys. All these experiences have happened while sober and within the past 2 years. There's a lot, so please give us a chance and let us know what you might think it is. Incident 1. First things the first, animals dying in the wild are common, duh. But hearing the screams of struggle and pain, it almost feels as if the animal is being tortured. I don't know if that is normal, but the sounds send chills down my back. Incident 2. Walking in the woods accompanied by my wife and kids, we stumbled upon a small clearing in the trees. Under the leaves were children's shoes. Shoes were worn out as if they'd been here for a long time. Incident 3. This one is hard to believe, trust me, I know. I was in denial and didn't tell my wife what I saw for weeks because it sounded as fake as duck. And I didn't want to catch any flack for seeing whatever it was. I smoked a cigarette out of the second-floor bathroom window last fall while scrolling on my phone. I had that feeling, as if someone were staring at you. I glanced away from my phone to look. I caught the peripheral vision of a humanoid-type being. I use peripherals because before I could focus on them to really see them, they bolted into the woods behind my house, east side. I was completely caught off guard and terrified. I didn't even watch it run into the woods. I looked straight ahead and acted as if I never saw it, like a deer in the headlights. I acted like scared prey. This creature was not human, and that's why I was so deeply terrified. It was tall, had shoulders, and had a head. No hair or color of skin. I couldn't make it out. It just wasn't normal, you know? It's weird because my brain didn't know what to do and couldn't process it fast enough. As I stared straight, completely frozen from fear, hearing the strides this thing had was unexplainable, and the speed it had rilling through with such ease in the middle of the night in woods that have fallen trees and torn bushes is honestly inhuman. I don't know what it was, that's why we're here. Months go by. Incident 4, same bathroom window where me and my wife tend to smoke when not wanting to go outside at night. We opened the window to smoke, but it sounded like it was pouring down rain. Both of us were completely confused because no water was falling from the sky. I walked downstairs to go outside, trying to understand what the duck was going on. The garden hose is on, and the handle is pushed into the dirt, shooting water into the tree above, making a surprisingly loud raining sound. Incident 5, feeling of always being watched only at night. In the daytime, the woods are normal and somewhat peaceful, but at night they are totally different. You have that constant, eerie feeling that you are being watched. Incident 6, at this moment, we have become interested and are sitting by our window every night trying to find explanations for what that humanoid thing was. We were in mid-conversation on a random subject. When a loud crack came from the ground right below us, the noise was loud enough and close enough to make us both jump and scare the duck out of us as we locked the window and stopped for the night. It sounded like either a bat or an axe hitting a tree really, really hard. From the humanoid creature and this loud sound, we've actually become afraid that our children sleep in our room. Incident 7, as we were lying in our bed, my wife woke me up at 2 a.m., freaking out that she smelled burning plastic and thought that something was on fire. We have a 2-story house, and our bedroom window cracked. We looked outside, because that is where the smell was coming from, and we saw a lit up triangular shaped thing in the back of the house, deep in our woods. It was of orange lights and blue lights/orbs next to it, and you could see shadows of people walking around the triangular thing. I immediately thought cult, scared to SHT, we were about to call the cops. But doubt set in when we double-checked the window. About 5 minutes have passed. Incident 8, after all this, we still have to stay active. So we went on a walk one evening with the children around the neighborhood. Noticing the sun setting, we headed home. Obviously, this place is weird, who would want to be outside? We got to our gravel driveway, which is about 100 yards, with tall trees on one side, bushes, and a smaller tree on the other. As we were walking about 15 feet onto the driveway, we noticed bats flying down left to right and right to left. We've only seen, up to this point, a couple in our side yard feeding off, I guess, bugs. With no car, I started walking down the driveway, and my wife stayed appreciative of the idea. The further down we got, the scarier it became. I underestimated the number of bats. I started running because my children became frightened. As I started running, bats, literally, I shit you not, began to line their flight path with my head. They would turn away, probably 5 feet from my face, maybe closer. I'm not exaggerating when I say this was ducking terrifying. As I'm running, trying to avoid these ducking demons, I hear my wife screaming as she flies past me and beats me home. My daughter, on the verge of tears, was saying she was so scared she'd thought she was going to pee her pants. Before everyone shits on this, I know bats are docile and pose absolutely no threat to humans, despite rabies. That's why this is weird as shit. I cannot explain why or how it happened, but it did. Incident 9, I personally didn't see this, but it was weird and doesn't add up. One Sunday, my husband's parents were over for dinner when he came to me and said, "Yo, my mom said she saw a chubby girl with a black sundress come out of the woods, walk the tree line, then rent her further down." Without knowing the layout of the land, I know it is impossible to picture, but you get the point. This lady came out of the north side of the house. The odd part of that is that the northern tree line of the property is pretty rough terrain. Steep hills, torn bushes, and loose soil. It would be hard to hike it, let alone in a sundress and not physically fit. Although about 1.5 miles north through the woods, you do pop out right outside of a small town called Coriopolis. See? Rational. But it's still odd with everything happening. Incident 10 is the last one. So far. If either one of us goes to smoke at night, at the window in our bathroom, we're always hearing this bell, which kind of sounds like one of those Chinese ceremonial dong symbols. Being skeptical, we thought it was wind chimes. We've looked, and there are no wind chimes at my neighbor's house. As our only neighbors, we have approximately 200 feet in between each other on our south side of the house. The bell sounds are coming from the southeast side of the property. This, too, we cannot explain. Conclusion. Please have an open mind and give us your opinion on what's going on. We're scared, and as you can tell, it's unbelievable. We don't know what to do. All these weird things just keep happening, and we're afraid they could take a turn for the worse. It's already overwhelming that it's the only thing we've been talking about for a long time now. My wife and I wrote this together. That is why the point of view changes on some numbers. I'm originally from the Northeast but couldn't stand the winters, so I went south for college. I was enrolled in my first year of university in the southern part of the U.S. The university was in a small city town, and going out to drink was the main thing everyone did. I was out with some other guys, playing pool at a small dive bar. An older guy came up, started talking to us, and asked if he could get in on a game. I'll refer to him as Brian. I was 22 then, and he looked a bit older, probably late 30s. We played a few games, and he commented about a bonfire party happening outside of town. He mentioned there were some girls he worked with hosting it and asked if we wanted to go. My friends declined, but I was single, so I said sure. As we left the parking lot in his truck, he said we needed to swing by his apartment and grab some liquor. This is when things go weird. I remember getting in the car, pulling out of the parking lot, and then pulling up to an apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The bar was in the downtown area, and we were now far away on the outskirts of town. I wondered if I nodded off on the ride because I don't remember the drive. I started questioning myself when he said he would go inside, get the booze, take a shower, and change his clothes. He offered for me to come inside too. The inside of his apartment was empty. No furniture, nothing is hanging on the walls, just open and empty rooms. He didn't say anything about it, so I asked if he had just moved in. He said yes, and he walked back to the bathroom without saying anything else. I thought about just leaving when I heard him get in the shower. Something about the situation was starting to creep me out. I was sizing him up in my head and thought I could take him if some weird SHT went down. I remembered him mentioning the girls and the bonfire, so I decided to hang around and see where the night went. The shower stopped, and he walked out wearing different clothes a few minutes later. He had 2 bottles of whiskey, and he just looked at me and said, "Ready?" We jumped back in his truck and pulled out. I made a conscious effort to stay awake and alert. We left the city limits and headed outside town on a dark back road. We were still on a main road, but we were far from town now, and the closest city I knew of was an hour away in the opposite direction. There were fewer and fewer houses as we drove, and the places I could see looked like decrepit old shacks. I had lived here for a couple of months but had never been out this way. We drove for a while, and I asked a few times if he knew where he was going. This was the middle of nowhere now. I didn't see any houses, and it was just thick woods on each side of the road. I didn't see him reading off of any directions or anything. I saw a small parking lot with a gas station and a turnoff. A lone streetlight lit the gas station. There were only 2 pumps, and they looked ancient. A red neon sign said 24 hours. The building was a double-wide trailer converted into a store. We turned off onto the side street and kept driving. This road was even worse than the main road we were just on. There were no streetlights, and it was very narrow. It twisted and turned, just snaking through the woods. No houses were visible, but I would see an old mailbox every once in a while. We came to the top of a hill, and there was a driveway. I asked again if he knew where he was going, and he just chuckled. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, with some dude I didn't know. Fear started to creep in. It wasn't at a house, it looked more like a garage or industrial building. There were no lights inside or around it, no motion lights as we drove up, no other cars or people. "Where is the bonfire?" I made my tone as direct as possible. He just went back through the woods. We drove past the building around the back, towards the woods. As we got closer, I could see it was a small path. As we went through, branches scraped along the truck's side. After what seemed like forever, the trail opened into a clearing, and I could see a few other trucks and people. Relief washed over me. I grew up in the city and wasn't used to shit like this, and I started to think I was just being uptight and needed to chill out. It was past midnight, and we left the bar around 10, so it felt good to get out of the truck. I scanned the group, but I could only see a few girls. A couple of guys were building a fire and trying to get it going. There were 25 or 30 people there. A guy who was introduced as Mike walked up to us to greet Brian, but he was staring at me the whole time. He never once stopped staring at me. Brian said he needed to take a piss and walked off, and Mike asked if I wanted a beer. He said to hang tight and walked away. Mike came back and handed me an open bottle. I said, thanks, and started to make small talk, but he just turned and walked away. I started to look around, and something just seemed off. There was no music playing, no lights, and no liveliness to the conversations. The people at this party seemed diverse in age, and I wondered how everyone knew each other. No one was talking. They were all just standing together in small groups and mumbling. Each time I approached a group of people, they would all stop talking and stare at me. It was standoffish and uncomfortable. I found myself standing alone and just looking around for Brian. I couldn't see him anywhere. I looked around for his truck but didn't see it. I had had enough of this weird SHT and was ready to go. I kept scanning around, looking for his truck, but it wasn't there. I didn't hear any vehicles start up or come and go while I was walking around. I turned back towards the bonfire and saw everyone looking at me together. All 30 or so people were now in one grouping, and they just stood there. No talking or movement. They were standing there completely still and just staring at me. The bonfire glowed behind the group, making the moment feel surreal. I stood there awkwardly and started noticing that their faces were changing. Their expressions rapidly changed from smiling to frowning to mouths and eyes wide to snarling grimaces. But as I focused on one to see if that was what was really happening, the face would appear blank and expressionless. Suddenly, one of the men started walking toward me at a deliberate pace. I turned and just ran. I ran up the path out of the clearing as fast as I could. My adrenaline was surging, and I kept running. I couldn't hear anyone coming up behind me or any vehicles, but I knew I couldn't stop and needed to put as much distance as possible between them and me. I started to panic as the trail broke off and went different ways. I didn't remember that from driving in, but I kept running. Finally, I saw the building through the trees and felt some relief. I stopped just before the edge of the trail. It was late fall and brisk, but I was burning up. I was wearing a flannel and jeans with boots. Not very good for running. I was sweating like a pig and needed to catch my breath. I couldn't hear anyone coming up behind me on the path or hear any vehicles in the distance. The light from the bonfire wasn't visible anymore through the thick woods. As I crossed the lot and passed the industrial building toward the paved road, lights came on inside. A second wind of adrenaline took hold, and I ran towards the paved road and kept running. My feet felt like lead, and my legs burned, but I kept running as long as possible. I finally got tired and moved off the paved road into the brush to hide and catch my breath. I didn't see any headlights, so I went back to the side of the road and began jogging. I was on high alert and kept glancing behind me, but I never saw anything. I finally reached the end of the road, which connected back to the main road and the gas station. I went inside, and an old guy sat at the counter watching a small TV. He asked if I was alright, and I said I needed to use a phone. He laughed and said, "Where did you come from?" I was out at a party and got ditched. He laughed a little and gestured toward the phone on the wall. I could see he had a gun on his hip and probably thought I was a tweaker coming to rob him. There was a phone book by the phone, and I called a taxi to pick me up. An hour later, I was back in my dorm and went to sleep. I never saw Brian again. I drove past his apartment complex but never saw his truck parked there. I never saw it around town or back at the bar, either. I remember it was an off-white single-cab Chevy. Late 80s model with a skull sticker on the back window with Roman numerals on the forehead. My curiosity got the best of me a few times, and I drove toward the small gas station. I followed the road to where the shop was and found it. I drove out a couple times, and each time there was no one there and no cars in the lot. The building looked even shittier in the daytime. I left and drove back to town. This happened in the fall of 2004, and I still get creeped out by it. So this happened about 7 years ago. I was around 19 to 20, and I was a scout leader. We had a camp in a forest. The nearest city was about 10 to 15 minutes away. Every year in July, we would have an international scout camp. Scouts from different European countries would join us. I was in the preparations team, and we would go around 2 to 3 weeks in advance to clean and put the tents up. On the preparation team, we had around 20 people. 10 to 12 men and the rest women. We were all in our late teens or early 20s. Anyone who has been a scout might know that the first thing in a camp is setting up a flag. The flag is an important part of this camping game. Other scouts would constantly try to steal the flag. If they managed to steal, then the lost team would have to go home. This never actually happened, no one was ever sent home, it was just a rule to keep other members involved and willing to protect the flag, therefore, we had to constantly keep an eye or a guard, a team member, near the flag. Other games involved attacking other teams and kidnapping members. All fun and games, nothing violent or harsh. It was fun and made us alert 24/7. So here is where my creepy story begins. One night, our preparation team was done with everything. In the other 2 countries from Europe, about 60 people were set to arrive in the morning. We had nothing to do, so we set up a campfire and started singing and talking. We had our guards, people from the team, set up in different locations. 2 near the flag, 2 near the entrance, and 2 in the woods facing the river. So we were tired and decided to go to sleep. We would change guards every 2 hours. Each guard had a whistle. If an animal or a person were to come to the camp, they would blow a certain note of a whistle as to alarm danger. That night, I was an hour into sleep when I heard a whistle. We all woke up and ran to the team member who had whistled. She claimed she saw 3 white figures running fast in the forest near the set-up tents. We thought that the morning teams arrived early and sneaked in to steal the flag or kidnap a member. So we all decided to stay awake and go into defense mode. We each stood guard in different locations, watching for any signs. After some time, we started hearing whistles from the deeper parts of the forest. We also started hearing radio sounds from different places. We saw some guys in white shirts running around in the forest. Me and 2 other people decided to check the empty tents to see if there were people hiding in them, but we couldn't find anyone. Then we started walking around, and we heard loud laughter from a bush near us. It sounded like a woman laughing. So we started laughing too, as we thought we had found the other scout team near the bush. Naturally, we walked to the bush without any hesitation. To our horror, there was no one. Then we heard more noises from another bush that was a little bit deeper in the woods. Then we heard a clear conversation between a few people speaking French in an accent. We could hear them clearly, so we checked that again and found nothing. Then we saw a guy in a white t-shirt running fast again in front of us. But his speed was weird. He was running so fast as if he were sliding. Keep in mind that we were in the woods at night with no lights. There's no way someone can run without making a noise. Somehow, this guy was running so quietly. It really seemed like he was just sliding. Again, we still didn't feel threatened. We just had an adrenaline rush, but it was more excitement to catch them than anything else. After all, we just wanted fun to begin. We were excited to see the teams again and have fun. For the next 2 or so hours, we kept hearing whistles and whispers in French, but we couldn't find a single person. It was so clear there that there were a lot of people hiding around us, but we couldn't catch even one of them. They were fast and so sneaky. It is important to mention that the arriving teams were not from France. So it was weird to hear them speak in French. Anyway, after 2 hours of running in the forest in the dark, I got tired. I didn't take this too seriously, so myself and a couple of my friends went back into our tent to rest. I laid down, and after 10 minutes, I saw a car light speeding towards us. This area is not designed for regular cars to arrive. None of us or the other teams had cars. A bus from the nearby city would drop us there and pick us up after the camp was over. We heard a car coming straight towards our tents with high beams on. It was coming so fast that we were frozen, expecting it to hit us at any moment. It happened so fast that we couldn't even run. Then suddenly, it just stopped right near our tent. We heard the door open but heard no footsteps. Whoever it was, just closed the door and left. We were shaking, and at that moment, it hit me that it couldn't have been anyone from the other teams. We got out and learned that our other teammates had also seen a jeep speeding towards our tent. But I didn't see anyone coming out of the car. After this, we just decided to stay awake until morning. Throughout the entire night, we kept seeing these white-shirted men sliding around us. We couldn't see any faces, they were fast and weird. We could hear her loud laughter and French whispers all around our camp. We could tell there were a lot of strangers near the camp who were either messing around with us or had plans to hurt us. The sun came up, and the strange thing stopped. We didn't manage to catch anyone or figure out who they were. In the morning, the other teams arrived. We had these leaderboard meetings every afternoon where we would discuss daily plans and meals and also share about any planned or failed attacks. All the team leaders said they arrived in the morning, so they were not even in the country at night. Up to this day, I have no idea who those people were. I have no idea what they wanted or what their plans were. They never attacked or kidnapped anyone on the team. It was scary when I thought of it. What would happen if we didn't have guards that night? What would happen if we were all asleep? At the end of the day, this was a campsite in a wooded area. And woods can be places where cults and crazy people gather. This happened in April last year. My husband's family owns an old farm with a large property with mountains, a lake, and woods. No one lives on the farm anymore, so we use it as a holiday residence. This is West Norway, so there are fjords and mountains and lots of red deer all over the place. There are no neighbors, and there are no animals except wild ones. There are old ruins from the Viking Age about 500 meters from the house, nearby the lake. There is much unknown history, and I find the forest very interesting. I'm Norwegian, and my ex, the father of my kids, is Canadian. He is not so much around anymore, and my daughter, 10 years, is very fond of horror movies, and my son, 9 years, also likes a good scare. To help them not forget their Canadian culture, I told them about the Wendigo. This was in the car on our way to the west for the Easter holiday, since there's so much deer out there. I told them a story, I believe, about Wendigo mimicking kitten sounds. And I told them that these Norwegian mountains were the same as the Appalachian before the continent split up, and that's maybe why they can be so eerie. The second day there, we cut down some small trees outside the house. The kids and I dragged the branches over a small field and tossed them down a hill. This hill is where the forest begins, as is the path down to the lake. My husband was in the garage, in another direction, fixing the chainsaw. As we took a break by the tree line, my son, with the Wendigo story in mind, started to make a special cartoonish cat meow that he thought was funny in the forest. He kept going, maybe 6 to 9 times, before I told him to knock it off and get back to help us with the branches. We turned around, and there was a very clear meow coming from the bottom of the hill. It sounded exactly like my son's meowing. It wasn't my son, he stood right beside me, and it was his voice and his characteristic meow. We shrugged it off as someone hiking and answering the meowing, and I didn't want to scare the kids for real and didn't remind them that it's private land and nobody except us goes down there, because the only walkable path is through the garden or small field. We got up to the garage, told my husband, and went inside for lunch. He was just like, well, lots of spirits in these woods, and then we didn't talk about it again. He's a man of few words and not easily scared. He grew up on the farm every vacation. He knows the land well and thinks it's mystical but not scary. My husband reminded me of the meowing in the car on our way there this Easter. We still can't figure out a rational explanation, so we just landed on the forest spirits or a very retarded fox. 2020. Summer. About 10 a.m. upstate New York in the mountains. I was walking in the woods on a nearby mountain. There are about 2 to 3 acres of trails to walk open to the public through a land trust, but if you break off it a bit, you can get to this old stone road. Not supposed to, but again, Deep woods. Who is going to stop me? The old road is either an old mining road or an old railroad that was ripped up, no tracks, but quite a few iron spikes. I had cleared the land trust trails that you are allowed to walk on and skipped through some highly dense woods to get to the sandy type stone road. Sometimes you see others on this trail, joggers or ATVs. I'd say that of the 50 or so trips I took out there, I've seen people on that road 3 times. Once a group of joggers, like myself. Twice ATVs. When I entered the trail, nothing seemed off. I began walking down the trail. The stone trail, not the public one. Everything seemed fine. It was just a bit more noisy than usual, but a noise I've never heard before. It was a noise, I can't actually describe it well. The best description I can come up with is that it sounded like a machine mimicking an animal, but not just one animal, like it was trying to mimic a bunch all at once. It was mimicking the bees, the birds, everything, but very poorly. You couldn't listen to one sound and say, this is that animal. It was as if it were all sounds at once, but a mimic of those sounds. There was an aspect to the sound that just wasn't right. It's so hard to explain, but do you remember those videos with AI voices? They don't sound human, but they are definitely speaking English. That's what these sounds were. They clearly weren't the actual animals, but they were speaking like them. Initially, the noise level was comparable to that of a moderately chatty restaurant. It wasn't loud enough to be noticeable. In fact, I didn't really notice at first. Then it started getting louder. About 100 to 300 meters down the road is when I first truly noticed it and got goosebumps. But I'm a dude, and I'm not superstitious, so I kept going. A really dumb dude, because I didn't bring any mace or weapon, and that area has both bears and mountain lions. It began to get louder. It went from the sound level of people talking quietly in a restaurant to a noisy, busy restaurant that made those mechanical animal sounds, not people speaking. At this point, I actually stop walking and look around. The hairs all over my body stand up. You know the feeling, the one that's way past goosebumps. The feeling you get as a child when you just know there is something you can't see in the closet. The kind that makes you want to cover your head with the blanket and tuck your feet so the monsters can't grab them. Well, because it was a feeling I got as a child, I said to myself, you're being paranoid. But I stopped and turned around to make sure nobody was behind me. I see something black and fuzzy about 20 feet behind me, lying in the grass. It was a baby cat, probably a bobcat, but I can't be sure. I got close enough to see that it was a kitten before it ran off. I see it, acknowledge it, and then turn back around and keep heading deeper into the woods. Now, though, with every single step I take, the sound is getting louder, and not only that, but now it's as if it's all around me. I got an intense feeling of being watched. Not by a baby bobcat, no, this felt like I was being hunted. Something was watching me with evil eyes. This is going to sound absolutely insane, but I kept getting this image of a Native American man flashing in my mind. I kept looking into the woods, expecting to see him watching me. Not as they exist now, no. The flash in my mind was as if it were one from a very long time ago. You know, now that I actually think about it, and I've only just put 2 and 2 together, there is some sort of memorial up there for a group of Indians, but it's all the way back in the area where you're allowed to walk. The land trust section. Not where I was. Anyway, I got the feeling this Indian was watching me. He wasn't mad at me, he wasn't happy with me, and he wasn't feeling any type of way about me. I kept getting the feeling that he was watching me intently. Despite this, I kept going. I said to myself, you're being crazy, there is nobody there. Very shortly after this, like maybe 10 more steps, I couldn't go on, I had to turn back. My entire body was shaking, and I was scared in the way a man gets scared. I didn't scream, I didn't run. I just said, okay, I'm leaving. The sounds persisted the entire way back, but on the way back, I saw a branch 5 to 6 feet long laying across the road I just came from. This branch wasn't there when I first went down the trail. I second-guessed myself. Did I miss my exit back to the land trust and travel too far in the other direction? No, can't be. I know exactly where I am on this road, and I'm not at my exit yet. I go up to the branch while looking around. At this point, I'm convinced someone has been watching me and following me. I get to the branch, and right next to it is a giant ducking paw print. Not bear. Not dog. I'm fairly certain it was an adult bobcat paw print. Which, considering I just saw a baby kitten, makes a lot of sense. I pick up the stick. It's now my only weapon until I get out of here. So I keep walking back towards where I need to be to exit this stone path and enter the woods to get back to the public trails. I get there, and the entire time, I still feel like I'm being watched. I still feel this Indian presence watching me. In my head, he was all black, but I knew he was an Indian because of his headdress. Again, this was flashing in my head over and over. As soon as I step into the woods a few feet, the mechanical sounds stop, and I go back to only having goosebumps. As I'm walking through the woods, though, something drops right next to me. Loudly, and at the same time, something swoops past my head. It was a ducking owl. It tried dropping something near me. I have no idea what was dropped. It then went and sat on a tree branch and just stared at me. I got out of there and haven't been back since. Of note, there is no cell service out there. I don't think it's relevant, but it should probably be noted. I have no idea at all what the sound was, no idea why I felt so creeped out, nor why I was getting flashes of an Indian man in my mind as the sounds got louder and began to surround me. The owl at 10 a.m. is a mystery. I have no idea why an owl is awake at that time. I thought they were nocturnal, and I have no idea why it tried to drop something on me exactly at the moment the sound stopped as I entered the woods again off the old dirt and stone road. The Indian, the owl, and the bobcat. None of these things made me think I should turn around. It was that sound that did it. It hit me in an instinctual place. I felt like I was being watched and in danger. It was almost like this thing was closing in on me. I don't advise anyone to go looking, but not because of this experience. There is a very bad dude who lives nearby. He's the caretaker of the land trust, and he tried luring me into his home one day. That's a completely different story, but that's why I'm not giving the location. Dude was a serial killer, and he even had that charm. You know it's a bad idea, but everything in my brain said, oh yeah, perfectly reasonable to go with this man into his home that I don't know. What really gave away this guy's intention was that when the original lure didn't work and I began looking around his property behind him at all the cars with different license plates, he tried using a different lure to get me inside. When I didn't respond, he got this confused look in his eyes and began trying even harder. His issue is that I'm antisocial and on the spectrum, and I've read about psychopaths and their charm. The second I felt like it was a good idea, like a fly to a light, I snapped out of it because I recognized what it was. I don't have proof that he was going to do it, but the circumstantial evidence is there. So even if you do, by chance, discover the land trust I'm discussing, at the very least, stay away from the old man in the home to the left. If you are at the right land trust, you'll know which. The home that has a bunch of cars under a group of trees with the license plates still on them from different states and art in the yard. To the left of the entrance at the end of the road you take to get to the land trust. All of the above is true. If you want to dismiss it, fine, but actually, what I'm really looking for is answers about that mechanical animal sound. I don't think the rest matters unless one of you goes out there, and in that case, I'm being sincere with you. Stay away from the old man. Unless he's dead, then you're good to go. My best friend and I lived in a neighborhood that backed up to state game lands, and during the summer we would spend our days riding bikes through the woods. There was a clearing back in the woods that we'd ride to a lot, but one day we discovered that if you kept going past the clearing, you'd eventually get to the road that ran out to the state gun range. I'd been out there before, but always by car. Since we had our bikes, we could explore. About 1/4 of the way down the range road, there's a bend with a pull-off and a trail, and that trail goes back into the woods, so we started on down that trail until we stumbled on the Scotia Barrens. It's basically just the remains of a mining town that Andrew Carnegie owned back in the early 20th century. If you go there today, all you'll find is a bit of heavily graffitied concrete ruins. But I swear, my recollection is that on that day we came across a large vertical concrete slab with a swastika top center, 2 years, like 1937, 1987, or something, and a list of names in front of some kind of reflecting pool. My friend and I got spooked pretty quickly and noped the duck out, only to pass a fairly Nazi-looking guy who'd just parked at the trailhead and was walking back our way with a fish tank. I've spent hours scouring the web for any evidence of this and can find none. I went back 10 years ago or so and couldn't find anything resembling even the slab. My friend has since died, so I can't confirm with him, and this all happened well before phones with cameras, the 1990s. There's all kinds of white supremacist groups around central PA, so it's not all that surprising, but it weirds me out that there's no trace of what I saw, physically or digitally. I don't exactly have the best memory and forgot about it entirely until something triggered the memory of it a while back, so I've started to wonder if I saw it at all. I distinctly remember the fear and how scared we were to see that guy, and the odd detail of the fish tank, though. I know we were there, and we saw something. I'm a wilderness survival instructor and security contractor. A couple days ago, a student of mine and a good friend who I had taken out into the woods before told me his dad just got 150 acres of land in a secluded, mountainous part of my state. It had a large amount of forest on it that hadn't been explored yet, as his dad was only building something for his horses that took up about 100 yards of the property, and his horses were free to roam at the moment. He said his dad got an insane deal on the property. My friend is now a dad of 3, and I know he doesn't get out into the woods that often, so I agreed to go with him because it seemed really fun, and I can imagine he needs a getaway every now and then. We are both indigenous, into cars, into wilderness survival, and all sorts of stuff, so we never run out of anything to talk about in the woods. His dad, however, told us that he didn't want anybody exploring the woods unless we had a gun. He said it was because he saw coyotes. Now we're all indigenous here, we were raised in the same state, and coyotes don't actually attack people. My friend, who we'll call RC, also told me a while back that when he was first at the property, he saw movement in the tree lines that was roughly human size and shape but couldn't really tell since his eyesight isn't that good. I brought my AR and a small flint knapping kit just for the fun of it, and we set off onto the property. We explored a lot of the rolling fields, creeks, multiple natural springs, and ponds. Everything felt normal, it was a beautiful landscape. Eventually, we decided to get to the forested part of the property, as it hadn't been explored yet. As soon as we entered the tree line, the entire mood shifted. The forest had an ambience of its own, very similar to the woods in the movie The Ritual. The woods were gray and dead silent, save for the occasional creaking of tall, tired cedar trees. There was a very small stream running through the center of it with sand that was black. It felt like we were surrounded and watched from all sides. It didn't take long before a very putrid stench hit our nostrils. It was the odor of rotting flesh. We decided to follow the smell and found the remains of 3 to 4 cows. We examined the exposed skulls and couldn't find any bullet holes. It didn't appear to me that these cows had been put down. Something killed them, though, and their bones were spread over about 30 yards. There were large indentions in the dirt all around them that were very vague in their shape. We decided to press on in the woods. Now we were accompanied only by silence, the putrid odor of death, and the sound of our own heartbeats. We kept stopping at the stream as I noticed several different types of tracks, large coyote tracks, and something else that was large but intentionally avoided the sand, it seemed. We pressed on into the woods until we started to find trees that had been bent over and pinned behind other trees while they were still alive, something that could never, ever happen naturally. We hiked on and found what I can only describe as a tool made of bone lying on the ground. It was extremely crude, but it looked like some kind of scooping tool or knife. It was disturbing because, although it looked primitive, it looked way more primitive than a person would make, but it was an intentionally shaped tool nonetheless. We hiked on until we found a clearing with a pond that had more large oval tracks surrounding it. On the other side of the pond, we found a very strange little tree structure. It was in a frame, and it had rocks placed up against it. However, it wasn't that sturdy, and the rocks were very peculiarly placed. We found no signs of any campfires around it. We found no camping trash. This isn't exactly a place you could hike to from a house. I photographed and made a video of the little hut thing. It was getting dark, so we decided we should head back. I had a flashlight on my AR, but I didn't want to rely on that in the dark with something that kills cows and makes tools out of their bones somewhere behind us. We made our way out of the forest and back to where the trucks were parked, just in time before it got too dark to see. As we were leaving, we saw something on top of one of the hills that we couldn't identify but didn't stick around to find out what it was. It's worth mentioning that the previous owner began construction of something on the property, abruptly halted construction, and left. I went camping with my girlfriend back in the late 1990s. I think I just graduated college, maybe it was my senior year. Anyway, we got a little pup tent and super basic camping gear from Kmart. We get on the road and just drive aimlessly. Our whole intent was to just spend 4 days camping in different places and visiting whatever attractions we came across. We didn't really have any destination in mind. The first night, we stopped for dinner at some truck stop in Missouri and asked the waitress if there are any campgrounds around. She tells us there's one that's out of business, but people still crash there. We drive there, and everything is locked up. You can still get in, but the bathrooms and lodge are all locked. It also looks pretty dumpy, with a lot of garbage. The place is deserted, aside from another couple who set up camp pretty close to the entrance. Being a dog lover, my girlfriend notices that they've got a beagle, and she gets all gushy about how cute he is, and blah blah blah. I drive around the campground, which is laid out kind of like the Olympic rings, or 2 figure 8 stacked on top of one another. We get to the very back of the campground, and it's filthy. We actually get a little nervous because it seems like this place is just a haven for drunks, drug addicts, and assholes who come here to party. But no one is here, just their remnants. As I'm driving, I see a little side road that's a bit overgrown. I figure it might be less used and we'd be less visible, so I head down, and it's actually a nice little clearing with 4 or 5 sites. They're pretty clean, and we set up camp. We play a game she brought called Mancala until it gets dark, and then we just hang out talking. Around 10 p.m., we notice the very faint campfire of the couple we passed earlier. Nothing special. I just noticed it through the trees and didn't realize we were that close. We head into the tent and proceed to get frisky. She was kind of vocal, but not screaming or anything, and I heard a dog barking. It's not just a random bark. This thing is barking like crazy. It sees something or is barking out of concern or fear. My girlfriend keeps riding. Then, we hear a loud, blood-curdling yelp from the dog. Then the woman screams. Then we hear a male voice yelling. We can't make out the words, but it sounds like an argument. A girlfriend abruptly stops. I've got a handful of tits and a thumb on a clitoral, and we're both silent and motionless. It was pitch black, but I can only imagine we both had confused and concerned looks on our faces. The argument continues, and we're trying to figure out what's being said. Then I hear a twig snap somewhat nearby. Not close, but not far either. All of a sudden, I get this intense feeling of dread. I guide her off and whisper, "Get in the car now." I grab my clothes and realize she's getting dressed. My heart is racing. I'm terrified. I really feel like someone is coming for me and wants to kill me. I say quietly but forcefully, "Don't get dressed. Just get in the car." She says in her normal volume, "I'm not going out naked." That's when we hear a guy say, "Did you hear that?" It was quiet, but it was clear. They couldn't have been more than 100 feet away. Our car was maybe 10 to 15 feet from the tent. I pull the keys out of my pocket and whisper, "We gotta go now." I unzip the tent, and we run to the car. As I hit the unlock button, the headlights and taillights come on. There are 2 guys standing about 50 to 60 feet away. They freeze for a second and then start running at us. We jump in the car, and as I'm jamming the key in the ignition, they get to the front of the car. I get the car started, and I look up to see these 2 standing there. They're about mid-30s and look like classic bedraggled hillbillies. One has a big stick in his hand, and he's holding it up. I had backed up to a tree, so I could only go forward. Keep in mind that my girlfriend and I are buck naked. The dome light hasn't even gone off yet, and I hear the one guy say, "What you all got in there?" I scream, "Move." The other guy comes to my girlfriend's window, leans down, and says, "She got some nice titties." And she did. They were spectacular. She grabs her clothes and bunches them up to cover them up a little. I roll down my window about 2 inches and yell, "I will run you the duck over, move." The guy with the stick says, "I'll take some of their titties first." The 2 start laughing, and the guy at the window leans down, and the first thing I think is that he's grabbing a rock to break the window or he's going to knife the tire. I throw it in drive and tap the gas, hoping to scare him away. Hillbilly, with the stick, doesn't even flinch. He slams the butt of the stick on the hood, looks positively evil as he looks me square in the eye, and yells, "You gimme all the money you got, and you can go." My girlfriend's window shatters, she screams, I hit the gas, Hillbilly rolls up and off the side of the hood, and I'm off. We get to the front of the campground, and there's a classically hillbilly pickup truck blocking the entrance. The couple who were there are now gone, their car was gone, but their tent is on fire. I quickly scan the entrance area and see a broken chunk of fence, the wood ranch fence with the 3 horizontal wood pieces. I head right for it and get out onto the road. We just haul ass. Maybe a mile down, we see the beagle run limping along the road. My girlfriend screams at me to stop the dog. I slammed on the brakes after making sure no one was following. She gets out and finishes getting dressed. I'm still buck naked, so I jump out and start throwing on clothes. She gets the dog, and his paw is all bloody. I see headlights coming from way behind and screaming, "Get in the ducking car." And we're off again. We get to a little one-horse town, and nothing is open. Even the ducking police station is closed. We park behind the police station, and my girlfriend checks out the dog. He's okay, but it looks like someone stepped on his foot, and he was bleeding from around his nails. She wrapped his paw, and we kind of rested for an hour or 2 until a cop finally showed up. We told him what happened, and he actually yelled at us for trespassing. Okay, yes, we did, but seriously? He says he'll check it out and that we should head on back home. I tell him I want to file a police report for my insurance, and he says, I don't have time for that. I have to go see a campground. He just leaves. My girlfriend and I wait until morning to file a police report with another officer. The first guy never came back and never reported anything. And we left. Instead of finishing our nice little weekend adventure, we drove straight to my girlfriend's mom's house. The dog had a tag, but it didn't have owner information. It just had the dog's name, Rookie. My girlfriend's mom had 5 dogs and lived on a farm. She was happy to take in Rookie, and he seemed happy to have a bunch of playmates. We looked online to find the owners, but the internet back in the 90s wasn't anything like it is today. We never found the owners. We never found anything about that campground. Rook must have been fairly young because he lived until 2011. This happened in 1998. My girlfriend and I are no longer together, but her mom liked me and sent me an email when Rookie died. Anyway, that's it. Oh, I almost forgot. Damage to the car was $4,800. Bodywork and paint on the hood, new front bumper, got cracked somehow, new window, new headlight assembly, broke it on the fence, and I had to get the right side repainted because I scraped the fence from front to back as I was leaving. Thank God for insurance. And since I'm sure someone will ask, the campground was north or northeast of Jordan, Missouri. True story from about 20 years ago or so. I had been living in the San Francisco Bay Area, but originally from the East Coast, and had never truly been camping. My girlfriend at the time was from California and was used to camping, so I went with her a few times. This was my first time with her, and her young son of 5 came with us to Big Sur. It was cool and had been rainy, but this night was just misty and cold when we arrived. We drove to one of those campsites that has a small parking lot, which was empty except for us. So we set up the tent a little bit from the car and proceeded to try and get a fire started, and she got mad because she asked me to get things started and I had no idea what to do. Anyhow, so the fire started. It was cold and wet, and after eating, we all crammed into a 2-person tent. Neither of us were gun owners, but I had brought a small knife and mini baseball bat, just in case, because I was not really comfortable camping. In the middle of the night, I am guessing because there was no watch, I was awoken by something walking slowly around the tent. I was so scared that I couldn't figure out if it was 2 or 4-legged. I didn't hear any other sound except what sounded like something trying not to sound too loud, at least in my mind. This went on for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes, and I was scared shitless and didn't move but kept my hand on the bat next to me. I remember assuming it was a bear or mountain lion, which I had no experience with. Eventually it sounded like it walked away slowly, but I wasn't really able to get much sleep. At first, I got out of the tent and sat on a park bench that was near us. After a little time, I see someone walking through the woods towards me, which again scared me as we had seen no one since being there. Eventually I see that it is a ranger or police officer, I don't remember which, and he seems to have his hand on or near his holster. I am wearing camo pants, have a beard, and look pretty scruffy, and I am a bit worried because I have some weed on me and the knife and bat. He asked me my name and what I was doing there, and I explained that I was with my girlfriend and son, who were still in the tent. After checking my ID and seeing them, he told us that there had been reports of a crazy guy going around and attacking campers in the area and to be careful and think about leaving the area, which we did because the weather sucked anyway. As it had been raining, there were no prints or other signs of what was walking around us. But it was scary for me, a city guy, not knowing if it was an animal or a crazy man. And I was super hesitant to go camping for a bit after that. I have to tell someone about this, and I felt like this was the best place to tell people. This all started when I used to live in a small town in Arkansas with a population of around 5,000 plus people, a typical average conservative town. In the summers, it was hot and humid, and in the winter, it was dark and cold. I grew up on Southern entertainment, driving 4-wheelers, hunting every deer season, and maybe some small trapping here and there. This happened during my last year of high school. I was 17 at the time, had a girlfriend, lots of friends, and a shabby 1972 Ford pickup. I still have it to this day. Anyway, it was November, rifle season had just started, and I had been preparing for it. My friend Drew and I had been planning this trip for months now, and we had everything ready. It was Friday, the end of the week and the start of the weekend. Our plan was to hike up through the national forest, onto the mountain, set up camp, and just have a good time. I wish I could have stopped myself. I woke at 3 in the morning, leaving a note for my parents and putting my things in the bed of my truck. I hopped in and drove to my friend's house. With him already waiting for me on his porch, I got out and said in a whisper, "You have all your things? I don't want to forget anything." "Yeah, I checked again before you got here," he said. He put his bag in my bed and his gun in the truck, and we took off to the mountain. I had my eyes drawn forward. On the road, Drew was sitting there with a metal click and the sound and smell of gas. I looked over, and he was flicking a Zippo lighter on, then off again, on, and then off again. "What's that?" I said, putting my eyes back on the road. "It's my grandfather's lighter, he had it with him all throughout World War II. We entered onto the turn that went through to the entrance to the hiking site. The change from road to dirt was just as familiar as ever. We stopped and got out, put on our bags, and headed up the mountain trails. It was around 7, and we could see where we were going. The sun was coming over the trees, the birds were chirping, and I could see the squirrels running through the trees, chattering. 3 hours of hiking later, we came up to the campsite that we followed with our map. When we got there, we quickly set up our tarps, and we were quick to find firewood and to start said fire. I told my friend that I would get us some lunch, and I headed off with my rifle to go get something to eat. I walked for at least half a mile south and found myself breaking the tree line. I decided I'd sit and watch for a bit. I sat underneath a large oak and looked for any movement, the sun rising slowly. I was sitting there when all the birds stopped for a moment. The silence was deafening, and the sharp ringing in my ear was eerie. I scanned slowly with my eyes only, staying as still as possible. Then I saw movement across the field. It was hard to make out. I slowly raised my rifle and looked down the hill. A deer had poked its head out of the tree line. I only saw its head and neck from where I was. I knew that if I risked a shot like that, I wouldn't have another chance to bag another deer with a better shot. Regardless, it was a doe anyhow. That's when I noticed something. The deer's head was higher off the ground than most deer should be. I felt like it was watching me. It slowly turned to the left. I could only see its neck and shoulders, and I could hear leaves crunching as it moved deep into the dark forest. A little unsettled, I decided to head back to camp. I followed the mental landmarks that I saw the first time: fallen trees, dried up creek beds, and I could see the tarps in the distance through the trees. When I got back to the campsite, we decided that it was time to catch some sleep. I crawled into my tent, got in my sleeping bag, and fell asleep. We got up early that morning. It was still as eerie as it was the day before. It felt so desolate. Again, no animals in the area, just utter silence. It was strange. The air felt heavy. There were no birds anywhere, no deer, rabbits, anything. Not even any crows cried out like they did, even if there weren't any birds singing. We went our separate ways. We were getting hungry, and when the sun set, we had been nestled down waiting for some game to come around. It soon grew dark again, so we came together and decided to make some beans that I had packed just in case we didn't catch anything. Drew got up from his seat and said, "I'll be right back, I have to take a piss." I sat there, drinking my water, watching the fire dance rapidly. Drew was gone for a while, and I started to get concerned when I heard leaves crunching. I jumped and looked towards where the sound came from. It was Drew. His face was pale. "Dude, come over here," he said. "What's over there?" Just come over here and look," he said as I got up to follow him into the darkness of the forest. Suddenly, I got a waft of something foily and repugnant. It got stronger and stronger as we walked deeper into the woods. The smell got so bad that when something fell on my shoulder, I got a little sniff. The reek of death made my stomach churn. I bent over and vomited. While it fell to the forest floor, it hit the ground with a sickening squish. I pulled out my light and pointed it at the ground. I got confused for a second when a drop of blood fell on my hand. I looked up, and my heart skipped a beat. What I saw was hellishly disturbing: animal guts, limbs, pieces. A squirrel had been purposely impaled on a branch. What was left of it? I looked at Drew's face, still drained of all color, with his mouth held open and his eyes wide. "Dude, what the duck?" I said. He drew fast behind me, and we bolted back to the campsite. I grabbed my rifle and come back to draw. "What the duck, man? How did they get up that high in the tree? Why were they on the branches?" I asked. I don't know. We sit slowly at our camp and just watch the fire." "Look, maybe we should leave," I said. "I do not want to stay here anymore, man." I drew. We started shoving our food and things back into trail packs. When we heard him crunching a few yards away from us in the pitch black darkness of the forest, he drew his shotgun at the sound, and I slowly raised my rifle. I pulled out the mag light and pointed it towards where we heard the sound. We were about 8 yards away from where we heard it. I flicked on the flashlight. And a deer was leaning its head out beside the tree next to some brush. With some relief, we lowered our guns. The deer suddenly fell to the floor. The deer's head rolled down the hill, and it stopped in front of us. There was no deer. Something had ripped or chewed the deer's head off and rolled it down the hill, but that wasn't the reason I was scared. Someone had been there holding the deer's head. It clicked, and the bones, guts, and other miscellaneous parts of animals hung on the dead tree branches. I looked up, and a grotesque, elongated hand came from around the tree. We bolted and clicked. The bones, guts, and other miscellaneous parts of animals hung on the dead tree branches. I looked up, and a grotesque, elongated hand came from around the tree. We bolted down the hill. I didn't care about our shit. They could be replaced, but we couldn't be. We phased in and out of running and jogging. We had our lights, and we were looking for a landmark, anything, something. I remembered that before we came to the trail, there was a large sign with the words Ouachita National Forest. I made that a point in my mind and searched for it with my eyes. My lungs were burning and my legs were in pain, but I kept running. I would glance back and check on Drew and see how close he was behind me. I turned off my flashlight, and so did Drew. We lay up against a tree, as still as possible. I could see Drew's frozen breaths in the moonlight. My eyes finally adjusted to the dark, and I looked over at Drew and turned on my light. An arm long and bony, it was covered in blood, the fingers were long, it had unkempt nails that were curved, it sank its nails into Drew's shoulder. Immediately blood started spewing out, he started screaming in pain, and he was lifted up, screaming louder, and more painfully, he was slammed on the ground. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. He was dragged through the forest floor, screaming and taking shots with his shotgun. With every shot, I could see his silhouette, moving farther and further into the woods. I ran. I just keep running. As I ran, I tripped over something, and I started falling down the rest of the hill. I slammed up against a tree. I stopped, my back was in pain, and I had hurt my ankle during the fall. It was quiet again, there were no crickets, nothing, just silence. My eyes had already adjusted to the dark, and I could see through the woods. In the distance, the moonlight was shining through the trees. I laid still as much as possible. I heard some leaves shuffling, and I saw that thing moving through the woods. It was strange, jagged, and tense. It moved so strangely that I can't describe it. It just felt wrong, it was tall and thin, and its bones were rubbing up against its skin. It seemed very malnourished, it shifted back and forth as if it were looking for something. When it turned, its face grazed the moonlight. I saw its features, its face was disturbing, it had an elongated chin and small eyes, dark folds of skin around them, the skin was darkish gray, its mouth was large, it spread all the way across its face. It had its teeth bared, jagged, and broken, its mouth and nose, or what was a nose, were covered in blood and meat chunks, the blood trailed down and covered its torso. I was about 10 yards away from it, it crawled on all fours, it came towards me, closer and closer, I could smell it, it smelled like roadkill, sickeningly sweet, but vulgar as well. I threw up in my mouth and held my breath. It breathed quickly and deeply. My hope at this point was that my death would come quickly. I still had some hope that I would make it out alive. Suddenly, the thing started speaking. It said, "James," in the most ungodly voice I ever ducking heard. The part that made my hope disappear was when it started saying my name in my friend's voice. It wasn't just like his, it had two tones, one deep and the other my friend's voice. It kept saying this as it crawled away through the woods, back up the hill. I laid there for, I don't know, how long. I cried silently. For some reason, I started moving my hand around, and I found something. It was cold and rectangular. I looked closer, it was Drew's lighter. My flashlight had broken in my fall. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bag. I turned and slung it into the woods and ran towards the parking lot. I heard the shrill and then the deep screech of that thing. It started screaming my name maniacally. Now, in that first voice, it is no longer my friend's voice. I kept running, I didn't recognize anything. I lit Drew's lighter and scanned the area. My hand hit something as I turned, and it made a loud wooden smack. It was a sign, and in the light it said, National Forest. I looked back and heard that same screech, and I ran through the tree line. Theirs was my truck. I thought as I ran. I flung my door open and jumped in my truck. I started it, flipped my gears, pulled out, and hit the gas, flying out of that parking lot as I drove, and I looked back. God, I wish I hadn't looked back. It broke the tree line, and it noticed me driving away. It stopped their parking lot light, now shown in detail. It stood, it stood. It was at least 9 or 10 feet tall, and its face, I'll never get that picture out of my head, looked angry. Its eyes were full of hate, and what I assumed at the moment was hunger. I looked forward and put the pedal to the floor. I tore off the side road and onto the highway. I looked at myself, my jacket was torn and ripped. I was covered in dirt and had cuts and scrapes everywhere. I pulled up to the police station, and according to what information I had gotten, it took a while for the cops to stop me from screaming about that it had drawn. A bunch of men got together the next day and rounded up a search party. With the sheriff leading the search, I refused to go. They scaled the mountain and searched for Drew. It was dusk when they found him. He was barely recognizable, they said. They found him under a rotten log. Note, some details of gore have been censored for listener consideration. I cannot express here how terrible I feel for running and not trying to help him. I still remember his tears streaming down his face before he was dragged away from me. They reported it as a bear mauling, but they all know what's out there. After the incident, my grandfather came and talked to me, and he said, "I'm so sorry about what happened to Drew. All the people in my town know of its existence. I've heard countless stories of local hunters encountering it. It's been 8 years, I'm 25 now, there is no day that passes that I don't think of Drew, he was my best friend. This is a warning, if you ever go camping, be careful and keep yourself armed. I never want something like this to happen to anyone. I wouldn't wish that experience on my worst enemy. I still hunt to this day, but I warn you, never go into the woods in Arkansas during the winter. You may just find something out there that you don't want to find, and it may just be me, but sometimes at night, when it's really quiet, I swear I can hear it calling my name still, from deep in the woods." So this has been stuck in my head since it happened, and I don't want to say it was traumatic, but it was a big lesson for me at the time, and to be honest, it was so off-putting and weird that it stuck with me. So I've lived in Western NC basically my whole life, and the woods are, I wouldn't say, a huge deal here, but there's not much to do here, so that's what people like to do. Hunting, hiking, and mushroom hunting. In all honesty, I've had weird feelings about the woods. Before and after what happened. However, that's never really kept me from going into them, and I do enjoy being in the woods, but they always give me such a dreadful feeling. Anyway, when I was about 7 years old, give or take, I'm 22 now, my dad was working for my grandfather, who owned this small warehouse kind of thing. They would do welding and machining for things such as boats and cars, and honestly, just for random stuff that people needed fixed. Well, it was tucked back behind other small warehouses that were surrounded by nothing but wood. Where my grandfather's building was, though, was literally the last one on the little road that went down there. This is significant because my father frequently took me and my brothers with him to work, ensuring no one could watch us. Well, I'm the oldest of my brothers, so my dad would pretty much let me do whatever as long as I was not in anyone's way, so we ended up bringing my bike over there, so when we got there, I could ride my bike up and down this road. I had a little route I would take where I would go behind some of these buildings between the tree line of the woods and the back of these buildings, and I would get to the last building, go around it, and go back down the road towards where my grandfather's building was. It was basically a little trail for me. I used this route for, if I had to say, maybe the next 2 to 3 weeks when I came over there. Well, one day I was just doing my normal thing, playing with my brothers, messing with bugs, or putting some trash on the ground. You know, normal 7-year-old shit. Then I decide, hey, I'm going to ride my bike a little bit, so I do my loop a couple times, and I can't remember why exactly, but I had to tell my dad something, so I went to go find him. I ride back to my grandfather's building, and I ask my brothers, hey, have you seen Dad? And they say no. I find my grandfather and ask him, and he says that he saw him outside last, so I do a loop around the outside of my grandfather's building, and, as you guessed, nothing. So I thought maybe he needed me and went looking on my trail to find me. So I took off, and I remember going the opposite way this time because I thought we would run into each other. So I go up the road first, then I take a left at the end of the road to go around the first building, and I remember thinking it was weird that I hadn't seen him yet, but TBH, I was just enjoying riding my bike, so I didn't care. Then I got to the part behind the buildings where the woods were. This time the woods are on my right side, and I still hadn't seen Dad to this point, so when I was roughly about a 2-minute ride from my grandpa's building, I looked to the right in the woods, and I saw someone in the woods, probably 75 to 100 feet away. There were a bunch of bushes and limbs of trees, and they were just far enough away that all I could really see was a black silhouette of a person. So I stopped thinking it was Dad, and I yelled, "Dad?" No response. Me, thinking he didn't hear me, got off my bike and started to step into the woods. At this point, I realized that they hadn't moved at all since I saw them, and it seemed that they were just staring at me. I didn't find this frightening at the moment, but I found it very odd because I was still under the assumption that this was my dad. I then started to walk pretty slowly towards them, periodically saying that I was looking for you and asking what he was doing. I was honestly trying to just get him to respond because, at this point, I was pretty spooked. When I was roughly 10 feet into the woods, they started to walk towards me, but they still didn't respond, and that's when I about shite myself. I stopped. I remember my adrenaline kicking in and my face getting tingly. But I completely froze. All I could get out was, "Dad, is that you?" There was still no response, but they still continued to walk towards me. I was scared to run because I didn't want them to run after me. I remember just being so terrified that I didn't know what to do. Keep in mind I was only 7, while of course now I would have dipped out way before this, but at the time I was just a dumb kid. I don't know how long I stood there for, but I do know they got about 50 feet away before I decided to run, and I remember the reason I, for lack of a better word, snapped out of it was because at this point the silhouette was still completely black, and I remember realizing that whatever this was really ducking tall. I want to say 8 to 10 feet, but that's not reliable at all because it was so long ago and I had a huge adrenaline dump, so I honestly couldn't tell you. I just remember it being abnormally tall, needless to say. I duck ran at this point. I left my bike and just ran to my grandfather's building. When I got back, I was crying at this point, and I saw my dad outside a bay door. My dad just finished smoking a cigarette and was going back in when he saw me and asked me what happened. I then told him everything. He told me to go with him to where it happened, and we went to check it out and get my bike back. When we got there, nothing was there. My dad stepped into the woods a little bit and didn't see anything. He told me that there was nothing over there, at least not anymore, and that we were going to be leaving soon anyway, so I had no reason to worry. So I grabbed my bike, and we walked back to the building with him. My dad never really let me leave his sight for the rest of the time he worked there. I don't know if he believed me or not. I've never brought it back up to him because I don't know if he would remember it. This all sounds so stupid and fake, I know, and I've honestly never told anyone this because of that, but that's why I'm on here. I was curious if anything like this has happened to anyone else, and if so, I'd like to know your theories. I thought Bigfoot for a long time was as stupid as it sounds, but now I don't think that was the case. I'm thinking anything from some sort of weird energy in the woods to some weird creep who just so happened to be there or something. Now I know my mind could have been playing tricks on me, but truly, I don't think this was just an animal, and I don't know. All I do know is that it's been in the back of my mind since I was a kid.